You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
We interrupt this episode for a shameless self-promotion. Everyone's a hero in January, but when it comes to February and beyond, not so much. If you want to be one of the few who punch the entirety of 2024 in its smirking face, then do it with Power Athlete. With an annual subscription, you'll get 365 days of performance-oriented programming delivered to your phone. It's like having a world-class coach, aka me, John Welborn, in your pocket for less than $1 a day. When you compare it to the month-to-month package, you're scoring a whole 2 months for free. And because I'm feeling extra generous this holiday season, everyone who signs up for a year before January 31st gets a training consult with me and my team worth hundreds of big ones for free. All you have to do is sign up over at www.powerathletehq.com/training. Don't be a just for January athlete. Commit to the cause with Power Athlete and crush 2024 like you hit it with a hammer. Remember, I'll say it again. That's powerathletehq.com/training. Now back to the episode. So what's up, man? Pleasure to meet you.
God, not much. Yeah, it's nice to meet you too.
One of my coaches, like one of our colleagues, a guy named Ben Skutnik, recommended you, and he shot me your contact, and I've been, stalking your site, so going over all your stuff. And
right on.
Yeah, I was excited just to have a conversation. I know you do a bunch of stuff with ACLs and winter sport athletes and force plates and some just really interesting stuff. I don't know if you know much about Power Athlete, but we also do certification, but really just work with not only athletes, but a lot of end users. So, what I'm always searching for is to have these conversations to be able to see, all right, like here's the tip of the spear. These are what, high level athletes are doing. And more importantly, how do we extrapolate this out for the everyday, guy training in his garage who still wants to kick ass?
Yeah. Love it. Yeah, no, it's great. And just so you know, like right now, like I actually, a lot of the work that I've been doing has expanded much more to, just like all types of humans, not just the winter sport athletes. So it's good to chat because the work we did with skiers definitely parlays well into just the other side of it, which is just helping everybody out, with research and stuff we're doing. So happy to chat.
The one fascinating one I was digging in on the winter sport athletes, especially the skiers, was the aerobic base. That's something that I don't know if people necessarily look at it like the big slalom downhill. It looks so like, high register, but all the research I've seen with, building aerobic base and the conditioning aspect for those guys is massive.
Yeah, totally. It's really overlooked, and I think I come from a kind of a, I don't want to say a unique background, because that sounds a little bit pretentious, but I'm just going to throw it out there. I think it's a unique background. I mean, I was an athlete at our Olympic Training Center here in the western part of Canada. We had like Charles Poliquin was my first strength coach, and I'll tell you right now, like just there's a lot of cool research that's been done over the years on those base physiology capacity. So yeah, happy to chat about that because I think it's a cool topic.
Where are you based in Canada?
I'm in Calgary.
Oh, so you're in Calgary. And then where are you from originally?
Ottawa.
So my mom was born in Lethbridge.
No way.
Yeah. So every year we, go to Whitefish and then drive up and, go through Lethbridge and then, Calgary Stampede. And then my family moved over to Vancouver, and then majority of them now live on the island. So.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, but my mom moved to California, and back in like the late 60s, she was working for an architect in Vancouver, and they had a big project in San Francisco. Met my dad, and she ended up staying. So it's we were very familiar with that part of the world. So.
Oh, right on. Yeah, that's awesome. So you're based in Vancouver now?
No, we're actually in Austin, Texas.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
gotcha.
I went to UC Berkeley. and then got drafted to play for the Philadelphia Eagles. And I ended up playing 10
Right.
years in the NFL. And then when I
Yeah.
retired, I was just happened to be home based in California. And then we were doing a bunch of
Oh,
military contracting, and just a lot of things were happening, and it kind of necessitated a move. And we picked a kind of a central location in Austin, because, obviously center of the United States, but also it was kind of small town. And we ended
yeah.
up, selling our place and buying a ranch. And it felt like we were living in the country, and I could build a facility and a gym and an office and everything on our property. And then all of a
Right
sudden
on.
COVID hit. Joe Rogan moves here. And now I fucking live in a sprawling metropolis that I wasn't expecting. Like it's like we lived on a little 2-lane road, like little country, like deal. Now it's 4 lanes. It's got stoplights. There's like
Oh shit.
7,000
Yeah.
homes that they've built in the last 3 years around me. And now it's like, I drive and it's like G-Wagon, Lamborghini SUV. Like, I'm just like, where the
Right.
fuck am I living? I'm living in like the Newport Beach of Texas now.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah. Yeah. I was down in Austin probably maybe in 2002 or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember being like, I was like, oh, that's great. Like sort of just the right size,
Yeah.
cool town,
Well, it's,
great vibe. Yeah.
I remember when we were kids, God, this would be, geez, I mean, I'm going to date myself 30 years ago. Every year we'd go to our family reunion, because this is,
Yeah.
I know, kind of an interesting piece, but my mom, grew up in Lethbridge. My aunt like eloped when she was like 16 with, my Uncle Bill, who's like 17 or 18. And they drove down to Whitefish and got married in Montana.
Right.
So every
Right.
year our family reunion we'd like fly to Whitefish. And it was like this little kind of, like the lake, and it was just like podunk deal. And then get in the car and drive across, and then, kind of go up and see all these sites in Lethbridge, and then go up to Calgary. And then my aunt and uncle, my aunt and uncle lived in Edmonton, and, we'd
Hmm.
kind of like that whole, Banff. And yeah, it was just, we did that for just a number of years. So recently I did a talk at like a marketing lighthouse deal, this kind of like marketing, and I have a degree in like classics and rhetoric, so they wanted me to kind of talk about like ethos, pathos, and logos, and help these people on their customer journey. And basically, something we deal with all the time, where people are out there spouting information but yet have no ethos, no background for it. Like they never trained any athletes, they weren't an athlete, they just
Right. Right. Right.
were really good at
Yeah.
parroting other people's information. So my whole talk
Yeah.
was like, authenticity is very easy to spot. I mean,
Yeah.
more difficult now on the internet. And just
Yeah.
talking to these people about ethos and how to create authenticity by actually crafting an origin story. So I'm in Whitefish, I'm driving around, and I'm like, oh my God, like this is insane. Like the homes and how everything's grown. And even, like looking at Lethbridge and how everything's grown. It's amazing. Just what I remember is these like little, like 1-horse kind of
Oh
podunk.
yeah.
Now I'm just
Yeah.
fucking exploded.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, I know. Yeah. Yeah. It's seems to be almost everywhere you go. It's booming. But um I that's really cool actually. I didn't realize your specialty in that area, because that's a really just like your past 30-second sort of dialogue about what your background is, and that topic, man. What a relevant topic for today's world, hey?
Yeah.
I think
Well,
it's going to become even more relevant.
and that was something that, like this is, classic art of persuasion. Like if you're trying to persuade people, and I don't use persuasion in like a kind of a sleazy way, trying to
Yeah.
talk their pants off. But if you're trying to convince somebody of an argument, like having, the intellectual chops and the foundation, and having done the work. I mean, going and actually
Yeah.
doing the research. I mean, I have a buddy, Tom Newman, who is out in Boston and done a ton of stuff with force plates and this. And he's like, I've had people that have come to different seminars or different talks that I've done, and a year later they're an expert just because they've read the information. And he's
Oh
like,
yeah.
a cool Instagram handle, some real jiggy marketing, and some cool stuff, and pulling things in, and all of a sudden, the layman doesn't know any different.
Yeah.
And
No, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
we interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Are you a field or court sport athlete looking to dominate the leaderboard? Let me introduce you to Field Strong. Take your inner athlete to the next level by exposing yourself to the advanced training techniques that contributed to my 10 years in the NFL. Unlock pinnacle performance and level up your athletic potential today. Head to powerathletehq.com/fieldstrong and claim your 7-day free trial. Now back to the show.
Yeah, and one thing that I've always remarked is that usually the people who are actually doing the work, they normally are not really that interested in that side of things, right? So it's like you see the people who are trying to actually, you know, really improve performance or to be in the, you know, be at the ground floor there doing the work. They tend to not really like the Instagram side or the posting, and they you don't hear about them. They just sort of live in isolation doing their job. And yeah.
Kind of similar when they shot me your information. I hadn't come across it. And Ben's like, hey, you got to check this guy out. He's doing some really epic stuff. And he's like, it'd be some great conversation. He shot me your stuff. And I'm like, damn, I haven't come across your stuff. And that's what, like, it blows me away in the strength and conditioning world, where all of a sudden, like, somebody can be doing amazing work in this silo and you're in kind of a similar deal. And all of a sudden they kind of meet and you're like, oh shit. Like, you know, here's a kindred spirit and a soul. I mean, you know, when I got out of the NFL, I got approached to work with CrossFit. So I traveled and taught a seminar for CrossFit for almost 9 years. And we traveled the world and literally influenced, you know, tens of thousands of athletes in a, how do I say this? A bait and a switch, offering them legitimate strength conditioning under the guise of CrossFit, because you can, you know, I mean, I can speak multiple languages. So like, you know, oh, you're going to do your WOD. It's just basically accessory and conditioning. Oh, you need zone. I mean, all the pieces that I was able to feed them, and, you know, ended up working with a ton of professional athletes and Olympic and kind of this, and then power athletes started through our military stuff. And, you know, recently I got approached to work with some Brazilian jiu-jitsu players, you know, and that's not something I'd ever done, but was excited to take on a new task and a new set of athletes that were unfamiliar. And then realizing that athleticism is pretty universal, that people need to be able to step, squat, and lunge. They need to be able to move in rotation, different planes of motion. They need to be agile, you know, supine, prone. I mean, all, you know, 360 degrees. Whereas I'd always looked at athleticism based upon kind of a vertical paradigm of like football, for example, you know, universal athletic position, different angles, cutting this. And now all of a sudden I'm working with these jiu-jitsu guys, and, you know, a lot of isometric contractions, a lot of slow moving. And it's very different than, you know, professional NFL football, but very similar in a lot of the demands and the injuries and the rotation. And then realizing that, you know, unless you're, you know, sprinting 100 meters and you got to run down a hallway, you know, athleticism is displaying that and being able to move through space and being able to, you know, enter these interesting positions and still be strong in positions where you never necessarily trained. So it's really opened my eyes to this paradigm of athleticism by working with athletes that were so far outside the realm of what I did, but also within the umbrella of combat sports. Right.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. No, the combat sport area is near and dear to my heart. I mean, we've had Calgary's, I'm not going to say it's the most well-known city on the map for combatives, but there's been some successful kickboxers, boxers, MMA fighters who come through the city, and I've had that little network that exists here. I've had an opportunity to train out several of them, and they're of all the different athletes I've worked with, they're among my favorite athletes to work with for that very reason, just because it is such a dynamic. That's such a dynamic sport, and there's so many different ways you can be strong. It truly sort of like elevates that idea that strength is, sure, it's a general umbrella term, but underneath the umbrella of strength, there's all sorts of specific forms of strength that, you just need to look at jujitsu to realize that, oh, right, there's a whole other level of what strength means there, to be able to use your body weight and your momentum to be able to create positions and advantages that actually do require strength. It's just not your conventional linear sagittal plane strength.
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show.
But
Well,
yeah, it's really cool.
the other one that blew me away was, I thought these guys would have a big aerobic base because of the amount of conditioning and training they were
Yeah,
doing, but just
yeah,
even putting them into some basic stuff, like they were so lacking in that zone two aspect. That I mean, increasing mitochondrial density and recovery, and so
yeah,
I had to dig back, and like go back and be like, all right, like how do we work on this stuff? Like where are we going to start? What are the tests? And we
yeah,
went back and started using, um, you know, uh, I mentioned earlier, Tom Newman made an interesting point where he's like, when you put on new tissue and you get stronger, you have to work on improving the plumbing. And that
yeah, yeah,
zone two and some of that higher register
yeah,
conditioning stuff ends
yeah,
up kind of building the plumbing. And we see this all the time, guys, go take a
yeah,
bunch of steroids, put on 40 pounds, and they just
yeah,
gas and they can't use, and they call it, unusable or non-functional body mass or muscle, which are
yeah,
just,
yeah,
fucking stupid terms.
yeah,
But he goes back, he's like, it's gas exchange. The plumbing hasn't increased. It's like you go put in all new fixtures and big dynamic toilets, but you're still dealing with the same shitty plumbing.
yeah,
And
yeah,
he's like,
totally.
a
Yeah,
lot of that gets overlooked. And you just
yeah,
have to go look at some of these high capacity athletes. Like we were talking about, like skiing, for example. And he's like, look at the cross
yeah,
country guys. They having such
yeah.
incredible plumbing and the ability to exchange gas and
Oh
able
yeah,
to recover in this stuff that we had to go
yeah.
back and look at a bunch of that to try to get these guys up to it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the one. I'm a in addition to the work that I do consulting wise, I'm a professor or a faculty member, prof at the University of Calgary. So I have a research program. I teach classes. I'm fully involved there, and I teach one class that's a grad course on periodization theory. And one of the main authors that I go back to, which is really hard to find a lot of their original work, is Yuri Verkhoshansky. And
Oh,
in a lot of that old writing, it still forms the basis for how we prepare these athletes who need big amounts of work capacity, which is this idea that your plumbing takes a long time to build, but the delayed training effect and the decay of that is actually what's nice is it's a little bit more gradual in terms of the fact that once you've got that built, and we would see that data in our skiers and in other athletes, it would be like year one, you do all this work and all this training and you improve these capacities. And then with a little bit of, let's say, competitive phase work, everything just kind of comes right back to baseline. Year two, we do the same thing. And then we go through the same phase and the decay is just a little bit less. And by year 4 and 5, with a minimal amount of work, they get themselves back up and then they can stay there. And then at the end, you get to see this development of this plumbing, right? That now that you've got that there, you're capitalizing on this residual that doesn't just drop off the cliff every time you stop training. And so I'm a big believer in it. And I guess because of the sports I've worked with are really pure. These sports are physiologically driven sports where the goal is really simply you train these athletes as much as you can to get them to be as optimal as they can for their sport. A lot of the myths around like how you train and what it does and how it affects physiology, I've been able to sort of see it with my own eyes. It doesn't quite work like that. So, I think it's like it's all coming around again, right? You can't just put on 40 pounds of lean muscle and expect that you're going to go out there and perform, because there's work capacity that needs to support that.
yeah. Well,
And Yeah,
and that's something that we're seeing in the jiu-jitsu world, just because, people are looking for a shortcut and, performance enhancing drugs because there's really no testing it within certain
yeah,
federations, So we've seen a lot of guys performance enhance and, they put on muscle and they get bigger and stronger, but I don't know if they're necessarily doing the stuff they need to or understand, just because the strength conditioning is so far behind. Like
yeah,
when I got
yeah,
approached, the guys came in first day and, the coach been like, oh yeah, no, they lift weights and they train. And within the first day, I was like, these guys have never trained.
yeah,
Like they're
yeah,
beginners, and just little things like, and I pulled this from Berkoshansky. I mean, the strength coach I work with in the NFL. I mean, we were big PAP guys, always post activation potentiation, something heavy, something dynamic. And it's really been the foundation of my training. I mean, we would
mm,
squat heavy triples and then go over and sprint 40 yards, and it was,
right,
rinse and repeat. And that ability to lift something heavy and then do something dynamic, fatigue neuromuscular pathways, and then find something way to be able to do them and explode out. So, I mean, being able to bring a little bit of that training with those guys, and then especially all the, med ball work that I stole from Charlie Francis.
Yeah. Yeah. Right on.
I do have a funny Poliquin story. I can probably tell it now that he's passed away. Do you know Derek Witzke?
No, actually, I don't.
Okay, yeah, Derek was one of his presenters, but I ended up my rookie year in the NFL. I ruptured my patellar tendon, and mid patella rupture, kneecap up. So I was at the time I was sponsored by Mauro De Pasquale. So Mauro had done all my supplements, and Mauro was kind of doing my diet and was kind of acting as an advisor. And he's like, "Hey, I'm going to put you in touch with my friend." So I called Charles on the phone. We got on. I tell him the injury, and he's like, "Don't call me back until you're taking 18 IUs of GH a day." I didn't even know what GH was. And it was like so ridiculous. I called Mauro back and I told him, and Mauro was like, I got somebody else for you to call. And he ended up hooking me up with Charlie. And so I called Charlie Francis, and Charlie, talked about EMS and protocols. And, we started talking about, max effort and no man's land. And, he's over there on a speakerphone smoking cigarettes, because he would stop and I'd hear this and I'm like, is he smoking? And really laid the foundation. And that was like in 99. Hey, this is what I want you to do. And really just put a lot of like the same stuff I use within all of our training programs and work with our athletes really came from that original conversation, especially the EMS protocols. And, hey, and I remember his conversation of like, hey, there's just no man's land. It's either you're doing tempo sub 75% or you're running 92%. And he's like, that middle piece, he called the no man's land, is where strength is built. He's like, that's where the majority, if you look at most strength training, 95% of it is in that no man's land. And I was like, okay. And he's like, what do you think that means? And I was like, I don't know. I was 23. And he goes, it just means that speed is not strength dependent. He goes, it could be for some people. If you're slow and you get faster, you could get faster. But when you get up to a certain level where you're already strong, it's not dependent. And then we got into this like neuromuscular efficiency and the training. And I like had a yellow pad, and I remember just taking notes, and it ended up being a huge driver in my training and allowed me to go play for another 10 years.
Yeah, that's really cool. Funny. That's a funny story about Charles too. I mean, Charles, rest in peace, but he was super influential for me because Charles, when he was working in the Olympic sports system, he wasn't quite that obviously he wasn't quite that vocal about those sorts of things. So I think he sort of had this mindset of what I always appreciated was truly trying to understand the science of it, even if it was on the fringe of sometimes in terms of maybe what was reasonable. But I find it really interesting that guys like Charles, guys like Charlie Francis, these kind of like Canadian what the word I'm looking for, trailblazers or whatever. I mean, they've had such an impact on thinking. Unfortunately today when I teach and I'll say in a class, I'll be like, hey, how many people have heard of Charlie Francis? So in this periodization course this past semester, for instance, I said, hey, so we're talking about this theory, and I'm like, so you guys have heard of Charlie Francis, right? And class was like, no. Like, oh my God. I'm like, you have to go search speed trap, and you gotta go and you gotta go read this, because these are, for the world we live in today, where we are a 10-second attention span for being able to capture a soundbite on something. You need to go back and read what's informed people's thinking to get to this place. And I always I've got some old literature from Charles Poliquin that's sort of been, in his era where he was really writing more science based about training and not so much about trying to get a groundswell in the more bro gym stuff. And then the Charlie Francis side is the same. It's like you got to go read some of those original texts, because once you get in there, things start to make a lot more sense, I think, because you start to see the evolution of some great thinkers around training, and how these different qualities and capacities support each other. And I think that's what we're trying to do, right? Is we're trying to understand how different qualities and capacities elevate the next one. And to the point that everyone hates the answer, it depends. Like, when does strength help you get faster?
When strength is a limiting factor. And
when strength,
Yeah,
Exactly.
and how do you know the strength is a limiting factor? Well, you have to run. You know,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
the one thing. I mean, and I've always credited Charles with this statement that if you're waiting on the research, you're going to be 10 years behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was so indicative. I mean, of just everybody, and he's like, I'm going to be wrong. Everybody's going to be wrong. But I
Yeah.
would rather be pushing it forward, and then all of a sudden 10 years we're like, oh, we weren't right on that. But he's like, we probably would have figured it out anyway. If we got to wait on the research, you're going to be 10 years
Yeah.
behind, and you're going to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
stale.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, I mean,
Yeah.
some of the stuff he was doing too with ZMA and sleep,
Yeah.
and dosing these guys with magnesium and zinc, I mean, was so intelligent. But then it was funny. We were down in Tampa, and I trained with a guy named Rafael Weiss down there, and Raf is a fucking wizard of himself. And we had a real good training group. We had about 20 NFL guys that were showing up pretty consistently. And one of the guys brought his buddy who was David Boston, and this is at the
Yeah.
height when he was working with Charles. And he came
Yeah.
in. I mean, the dude looked like $1 million. He had like this
Oh,
chest
yeah.
and these quads. He couldn't do anything. He
Yeah.
couldn't change direction. He couldn't sprint. He couldn't run. He
Yeah.
couldn't lift weights. And Charles had been training him like a bodybuilder, and a lot of sets to failure in this. And it was pretty interesting as we started rapping with him about his training. I realized that powerlifting and bodybuilding, even though it feels like every strength coach has a powerlifting background, they found like the local powerlifter with a shaved head and a beard, and he's now your strength coach, didn't carry over. I mean, being strong
No.
was helpful, but for me, there was a point where strength was diminishing, and I got that from I don't know if it was in Science and Practice or Mel Siff's book, Super Training, where they talked about the shot putter. I think it was like a 200 kilo bench, and the amount of time that they put it to get him to a 220 kilo bench actually reduced the velocity of the shot put. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was something that I was very prevalent on. And for me, there were certain numbers that I could hit where I was at my best playing. And all I had to do in the off season was work back to those numbers, and the work to go past those numbers took away from everything else.
Totally.
And,
Yeah.
because, for the NFL, you're like, how strong do you need to be? And it's like, well, you need to be infinitely strong. Well, I mean, what about speed? What about this? I mean, I'm not going to be 380 pounds. I was a 310 pound guy. So for me, speed and the ability to hit people as hard as I could and move through space was as beneficial as being a mass monster. So it was very specialized. And when I would talk to other players and they would ask me, I'd be like, you have to figure out what the right combination for you is. For me, this is, I have, just a certain skill set. Like I'm super flexible in my hips. So I could sit at actually a position where my hips were below my knees, and I could play upright, and I'm 6'6", so I could play short and look around and had good mobility in that way. But a lot of guys couldn't play that deep. And they were like, how do you do it? And I'm like, well, fuck, dude. I RDL fucking 600 pounds for reps. I can back squat 600 pounds for reps. And I got like a 34-inch vertical, and I'm super flexible in the hips. So it's one of those things when you get to this like pinnacle, like the top of the peak in these sports, there's certain characteristics that allow you to be the best version of yourself. And totally. That piece is what I try to explain to people. I'm like, when you get up to these pieces, but there's information that you can pull back that you can give to the general masses and work with people training in this like workup phase,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I mean, what's funny is that it's hilarious about the David Boston story, because there's actually a really funny story as well with Charles here working with our short track speed skating team back in the 90s. And, it's for those of you who don't know, it's a race inside of essentially like a hockey rink. But the coach went to Charles and said, hey, Charles, want you involved with the team and want to have you help us design the program. And Charles said, okay, first thing we're going to do is we're only going to lift. And, he took everything out. And Charles's view at the time was that for strength training, I remember I was like, Charles, don't you this was early days. I'm like, what about, what about improving power and rate of force development capacity? I mean, everything I was reading from European texts at the time and other European scientists in strength training were all talking about this. But I'm like, Charles, like your programs don't really seem to really prioritize that. And he's like, it's a waste of time. He's like, just worry about hypertrophy and strength. That's your two things. And I was like, God, that just doesn't quite make sense. And so these are early days, but that story about, Charles working with the short track speed skating team, it was like these athletes were just absolutely jacked by the start of the season. But of course, it backfired because they didn't have any of the other things that they needed in place to be able to do what they do. And after that point in time, I'm talking like now this is like the '90s, and I'm in my early 20s and just sort of starting this whole journey. But after that point in time, I spent another 25 years in Olympic sport, and I get to really work with all kinds of coaches. And another thing that I come to terms on is that it's not even about only thinking about what your own formula is. Like I would realize that was a big piece of it. But then you would see coaches that would come in and they would take someone's formula and then they would build a training strategy around that formula. And they would all have slightly different ways to create success for that athlete. They would always boil down to a similar thing, like maximizing their strength. But the way they would take all those ingredients and dump them into their training program, it was like I started to realize, like, holy shit, there are more than just one way to create a training program to maximize somebody's talent.
Sure.
And and what's so interesting is there's probably an equal number of ways where you can come there and completely destroy that athlete's abilities.
Sure.
And I saw both ends of the spectrum. It was like this living lab where we'd have, a coach would come in, drop in these ingredients, just like you described, drop in these ingredients around somebody's talents and strengths, just how you described, but slightly different viewpoint. And man, athletes would just explode in their performance. And I can remember the same athlete getting dropped into a different paradigm where, someone would come in with some outlandish view on their, weaknesses or what they needed to do. And always interestingly, I'm not going to say always, but a high fraction of the time, it's these what I call foundational performance factors. And I term foundational performance factors exactly how you described strength supporting speed. Is that to a point, strength is a foundation, but it's not like you need to get it to a place, right? But that beyond which it's not necessarily the determining factor. But these foundational performance factors, when they start to take the main frame and you start chasing that as your KPI, I can tell you that whether it's chasing aerobic base or strength or any of these foundational performance factors, when it starts to override what that athlete actually needs, man, it will kill their mojo. I've seen world class sprinters get absolutely buried for 2 years with nothing left in their system because of chasing a KPI that was the wrong one to chase. And
Yeah.
Man, it's like when you see it happen, it's like, holy shit, they've lost everything. Like they can't, their confidence, their swagger, their ability to make those magic moves, that ability to do the things that make them, that define them as an athlete, man, they evaporate. And then what's so interesting is you get them back in the right mix and you'll see it, they come back to life. And, it takes a bit of time, but it's a really interesting observation. It's
Uh,
one that I wish people would consider more.
as you were talking about this, the example that came up to me was increased flexibility, right? So they had this deal where
Yeah,
if you can improve your stride length, I think it was like 1 inch over the course of 40 yards, you can shave 0.2 of a second off. So then they started doing all this passive range of motion, this kind of passive stretching, not realizing that the difference between active flexibility under load versus
yeah,
passive is very different, and one doesn't
yeah,
necessitate the other. So arguing with people and being like, dude, just stretching is fine. You want to relax your nervous system, does it help? Sure. But at the end of the day, I need you to be flexible under load, under duress. How do we
yeah,
do that? We have to be flexible when we lift weights. And I
yeah,
always told them,
yeah,
I'm like, dude, lifting weights is just stretching under load, because
yeah,
when you sprint as fast as you can, and we saw this, people were like doing all this kind of passive range of motion stretching, and then they went out and they were less stable when they sprinted.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
remember, being like, dude, I would rather, you be more flexible under load. So the other one is task specific tension. This
yeah,
idea, one of the injury mechanisms I saw happen over and over in the NFL was guys would be setting back, they would rotate, and then they would get loaded to the side and they'd end up hurting their back, or, blowing out a
yeah,
disc or messing things up.
yeah, yeah,
And the idea was that they would kind of get loose in their stomachs. They would get real tired. So then all of a sudden, when people get tired, they start arching their back and they're loose in their trunk. And they were really weak within that transverse plane, especially in that rotation.
yeah,
So seeing that happen over and over again, you can either just ignore it, or you can look and be like, okay, how do I mimic this in my training? So that's where
Yeah.
we got into, everything from like an 8 pound med ball to a 40 pound med ball. And I started doing all this different positions, stagger stance, bilateral, from a kneel, all these different rotational throws. And that was what I was
Yeah.
saying, when Charlie sent me all this med ball stuff. I mean, I fucking program that daily. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like, and I steal it, and I tell people I steal it. So to the point where I was out at Westside Barbell, and Louis Simmons was working with one of their sprint girls, and he was doing all this Charlie Francis med ball work. And I even said to him, I was like, "Did you tell these people you stole that from Charlie?" And Louis like, "No, I don't tell them anything." But
Yeah.
that became so important. And then all of a sudden, I'm playing, and I go to rotate, and somebody hits, and all of a sudden, I don't have any issues.
Yeah, I know.
And I'd seen
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
injury mechanism over and over again. It's like,
Yeah.
I took a strongman's poll, and this is just something I've always, and I'm not OCD in any way, but I do look for patterns. And
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
of the ones that I saw over and over again, guys would take a big hit to the head,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden, it could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, could be 3 weeks later, they ended up tearing
Yeah.
ACLs.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
whenever I'd see the ACL tear, I'd be like, "Ooh, what side?" And they'd be like, "Right knee," and I'd be like, "That dude took a big hit to the head." Or something
Yeah.
happened, or this guy got kneed. And then we had a guy on
Yeah.
the podcast who was like, "Oh yeah, no, there's a direct connection between head trauma and ACL tears."
Yeah.
And I
Totally.
told him, I was like, "Dude, I assessed this over 10 years ago, just because the
Yeah.
amount of ACL tears always followed guys that took big hits." And you can go
Totally.
back and
Yeah.
look at it.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It is a statistical effect for sure around the increase in lower body injuries after a head trauma. And what's so interesting is one of the things in my lab these days that we're really like I'm really trying to explore in a more standardized way. It's always the trick, right? It's like, how do you study somebody in the real world? It's so complex. Like, you have to reduce it down a little bit. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to look at. But we were just able to get this robotic, it's basically like a robotic leg press. And we can control position and speed and everything you'd ever want to do in a contraction multi-joint though. So, you're using your leg like you would in a normal world. And one of the things we're really interested in studying, and this is something I used to do I did do with our research on the skiers, is looking at what we can measure co-contraction. And so when you create co-contraction for a joint, it's how you regulate the stiffness in that joint. And I think that's a big thing that's important for creating that dynamic knee joint stability in these moments, and for changing direction or landing. And a big question is looking at how brain injury and how essentially strength, how levels of training impact that co-contraction ability. And I'll tell you, like, you can measure this stuff, and we've seen it in our skiers, looking at how they regulate their muscles around their knee joint. And it's absolutely fascinating, and it's a fascinating area. And if you move one step further into from athletes into the world of like diseases that affect humans across, whether it's Parkinson's or what have you, it's the same thing. And it looks like, you're trying to either optimize your system to create stability, which is not very energy effective,
Mm-hmm.
or you're doing it to optimize for being able to react to your environment. One of the reasons too, I think, that people with ACL injury, it's like they lose that step when they get back, is now they're optimized too much towards stability.
Mm-hmm.
So they're protected. And then on the other hand, you can be not optimized enough. And so you're finding this like sweet spot window of like, how do you create a responsive nervous system, that can scale it up when needed and can bring it down for dynamic responses to their environment when not. But I think it's a fascinating topic. I'm really pushing ahead with this research, especially around how I'm really interested in how males and females regulate eccentric loads. There's this sort of statement that females are 4 to 6 times higher chance of rupturing their ACL than males, and I think there's some real things in there that are happening biologically that are different between males and females. But the other thing that is just a leveling that has never really been looked at is when you strength match males and females, you take strong males and strong females and compare them, and you compare weaker males and weaker females. There's more similarities based on their strength than there are based on their biological sex. So, why that I think that's important is that you take a strong male and strong female and compare their movement strategies and, their strength profiles. And it's like, wow, you know, there are a lot more, there's a lot more in common with that, which suggests to me that we can train these things.
Mhm.
But I just don't think we've looked at them in a super integrated way, because a lot of the time we're left looking at crude measures of strength, crude measures of co-contraction. We see it, but we can't really measure it.
Sure.
But then people like yourself who live in that world, you're like, man, I see these correlations. Like I'm seeing this stuff,
I
and it's fascinating stuff.
So I tore my ACL in '96. Or no, I didn't tear my ACL in '96. I think I tore it before that when I was in high school. But I'm what is known as a compensator. I tore my ACL and didn't even notice it.
Hmm.
And then it wasn't until my third year of college, I was running, we were doing a reverse and I was coming around and the grass was pretty wet and slick. And I like slipped and kind of like fell. And all of a sudden my knee swelled up and I, tore some cartilage. So they were like, they went to drain the fluid and there was no blood in it. They're like, oh, this is great. You didn't tear an ACL. We're just going to go and scope. You'll be back in like a couple weeks and you can play in the bowl game. They go in and I'm missing an ACL.
Huh.
And what was wild was when the doctor took me in the table, he checked and he's like, yeah, your ACL's fine. So he wasn't able. And then all of a sudden, when they put me out, all of a sudden the guy's like, oh shit, this guy doesn't have an ACL. So
Yeah.
I have way overdeveloped hamstrings. Like it's
Wow,
to the
that's so
point
cool.
where the guys that I train are like, dude, like in shorts are like, those look like steel cables. I'm like, yeah, that's why my knee doesn't move. But
Yeah.
they fixed the ACL. I came back, and then at some point within the next from 96 to I retired in '09, the ACL just either disintegrated or I tore it again. Never
Hmm.
noticed.
Hmm.
But when I went to get my knee scoped, the doctor told me, he's like, dude, you don't have an ACL. But what's weird is, and this has since happened from, I think, all like the micro kind of movements like this, the popliteus muscle ended up taking the brunt of it. And now I'm getting calcification of that. So when I
Oh,
went to go
wow.
see the doc, he's like, this is strange. He's like, we haven't seen this yet, but he's like, not only your hamstrings and your adductors overdeveloped, so your knee is locked. Like I can't tell you that it's you're not missing an ACL, but he's like, it's almost as if your popliteus muscle has taken
Wow.
over and it's thicker, but it's also calcifying because of the amount of swelling. Swelling too long creates calcification. So
Yeah.
now I have osteophytes and calcification in that popliteus muscle. And the
Huh.
doctor's like, did x-rays and kind of looked at it. He's like, it's like 3 times as big as the other one.
Wow.
And so he's like,
Huh.
what I think happened from, playing and all the stuff you've done, sprinting and running, the
Yeah.
popliteus muscle is being asked to create stability with the hamstrings and
Wow.
all these little like micro
Cool.
movements.
Well, I
So, I
guess
mean,
it's not cool, but I think it is pretty cool. That's
oh,
amazing.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I was supposed to go get it cleaned out, and the guy, and then there's
Yeah.
also, I got some like a horn underneath the kneecap, and they got to clean all this out. But
Right. Right.
what's crazy is I have no knee pain, and I
Huh.
still squat and I jump and I run and I can do all these things and I
Yeah.
do hits. I'm just missing range of motion because where the calcification hits has kind of created a doorstop where I can't get my
Okay.
heel to my butt anymore, but I can squat to
Right.
90, and
Huh.
I have great hip mobility, so I can hide it. So
Right.
it's funny.
It's
Like I go
amazing.
to jits and I can kind of get away just because I've got good hip mobility and movement, and I'm super
Yeah.
good in the rotation and these other pieces. So
Yeah.
it's pretty interesting. Whenever I see a doc or anybody works on me, they were like, "Dude, you are the definition of a compensator. You've somehow figured
Yeah.
out how to work around these things."
Yeah.
He's like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
whereas other people would have just been like, I'm hurt. I'm just going to lay here. I can't do anything. He's like, you just got up
Yeah.
and just kept going. And he's
Yeah.
like, I
Yeah.
don't know if
Yeah.
that's indicative of intelligence or lack of intelligence or stupidity. I'm like, it's probably a little bit of both. Whereas
Wow.
I just always figured my body would do whatever I needed it to
Yeah.
until the day when it didn't. And it's
Yeah.
always been there to answer the call. So whenever
That's really interesting.
like
Yeah.
whenever people come to me and they're like, I've torn an ACL and this, and I'm like, dude, it's not the end. And it's a lot better.
Yeah.
The surgeries are so much cleaner. The rehab
Yeah.
protocols, getting the muscles to
Yeah.
fire. There's so many more things that we can do. I mean, the work that
Yeah.
Craig Bueller does with the Amit stuff and the Olympic skiers is incredible, and getting those muscles
Yeah.
back to fire. I mean, there's like the information today is so much better. The problem
Yeah.
is there's so much noise and so many people
Oh, I
screaming
know.
shitty stuff that you almost
Yeah.
have to wade through it and be like stop listening to idiots. Um,
Yeah.
like If it was all based on hypertrophy, it'd be a bunch of bodybuilders out there, but it's not. And I saw
No, I
guys
know.
go on
Yeah.
and put on a bunch of, like we were saying, the David Boston effect. He showed up at 240 pounds looking like a pro bodybuilder and
Yeah.
couldn't last in anything. He couldn't sprint. He couldn't
No, I
change
know.
direction. He couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
so, and then this idea of like functional, non-functional muscle, which kind of fucking bothers me because it's
Hmm.
mass. It's just, and the thing I like, the reason that you guys think it's non-functional is because he hasn't created better plumbing. He just added
Yeah.
on to his house, but he didn't create the plumbing. He didn't do any of
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's the work that's really unsexy, sucks to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And, nobody, like, it doesn't look good on Instagram.
No, it doesn't. And it's, you know, um, I think it doesn't look good on Instagram, and it's boring, and it seems impractical, and it sometimes seems not innovative. And then you go back, and that's why I think the crucial thing here is you go back to first principles of physiology, and you have a system that helps inform how you think about problems. And I like one of the things when I teach on periodization theory is I don't call it general prep. I'm like, there's nothing general about anything. It's acquisition of foundational performance factors that support the things you need to do. And you need to ask that in the plumbing is a great analogy. I'll probably steal that from you. But think about it
Well,
like
I stole
plumbing.
it too. Yeah, I stole it
Yeah,
from Tom Newman. So you're licensed to steal it from me.
I'll steal it from you with
Yeah.
reference down the road to Tom Newman. But yeah, it's exactly that, right? And I think that sometimes what people forget is that acquisition, that's why I call it an acquisition phase, is about acquiring foundational performance factors. And that depends on your training age, your injury history. It depends on how you play the game. It depends on whether you're a workhorse or a thoroughbred. Are you a sympathetic, high power, twitchy athlete? Are you a more base workhorse oriented athlete? There's all of these things that I think influence the degree to which those the acquisition of those foundational performance factors become either a higher or lower priority depending upon where you are in your training age.
But you
And
have
then
to
man, there's
train. Like,
got to train.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
so the way, like, I couldn't agree more. And the reason I was jumping in is it's almost as if like athletes are just, let's say, like a block of granite and like
yeah,
have all these things, but until you start chipping away, you don't know who that individual is.
yeah.
So I mean,
Agreed. Yeah,
that's something we've done is like in this amateur beginner phase, like
yeah,
I don't know who you're going to become at the end of this
yeah.
thing. Like these, all of a sudden these traits start to get trained, and whether it be
Agreed.
genetics, geography, or opportunity, training
Yeah,
environment, or just how you're fucking wired,
yeah. I
all of a
know.
sudden
Yeah,
now you're kind of like, the past diverge. And the problem is
yeah,
most people have, hey, this is what we do. And
yeah,
as they clear away the rubble and you go from this kind of beginner and the thing I've said this for years is I wish I was a beginner every single day of my life.
yeah,
Basic linear progression, add weight to the bar every time, unadapted nervous system, very simple, basic movements, all I need to do.
yeah,
And then I get to a point where that fails. And now I got to pivot, and now I got to get more jiggy on my training. Now that
yeah,
the rubble's cleared away, and now all of a sudden these characteristics are more available.
yeah,
And now
yeah,
I have to find what program fits with me, or more importantly, like
yeah,
almost a philosophy or a
yeah,
system that I find.
yeah,
And that becomes difficult because when I look at a lot of strength coaches, they're kind of like, this is what we do. And I'm like, yeah, but you're
yeah.
assuming that everybody fits within your box. What if they don't?
Totally.
You know,
Yeah,
that,
totally. Yeah, yeah.
and that's that
That's it.
individuality.
That's totally it. And it's one of the reasons why in my evolution over the past 2.5 decades, and having especially now being more in a position of education, whether it's through my website and through my courses there, or through teaching at the university or what have you, or whatever venue. I've always tried to say, I know what you want me to say. What you're asking me is you want me to give you a formula and a step-by-step process to be able to design something for somebody that gives you a tool in this conversation that's going to help you tomorrow directly. If I just do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to get that result. And I always say, listen, that would be so unfair for me to do, because if I can help you understand the system and the physiology of it, I think what you can do is then you can take that system and you can begin to think about problems more effectively. And that was always something I realized, is it's like you need a system and an architecture to be able to sort of approach a problem. And then to be able to say, okay, how am I going to figure this out? And one of the key things, going back to your previous story, is I always start with watching how athletes move in, and I ask the question when I see something that doesn't fit with my paradigm, why are they doing that? Like, curious, like,
Yeah.
why is he moving like that? Why are his hamstrings, why do they look like that? That's so interesting. I wonder what's going on with why he's adopted that strategy. And why I start there is that I so many times where you'll go into a seminar and you'll have somebody bring somebody up and be like, let me tell you everything that's wrong with you. Oh, this doesn't fire, that doesn't fire. Look at this, look at that. Look, I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. And you need to, it very well could be the case that you're like arriving through your process of your system to say, shit, you know what? I think that's something we need to influence here. And we need to change that to be able to sort of push the system towards something more ideal. But man, it's I think that approach of being able to kind of take a step back and see what's ahead of, like, in front of you, man, that's been one of the biggest things for me as a strength coach that I took. And unfortunately, it wasn't from people like Charles, because Charles might have had a more specific view of how those things worked. And no disrespect meant there, but I think that things have evolved, and things do evolve in a global way, and you start to realize that, I'd see it with athletes who'd come through and they'd be training underneath in a Chinese system versus a Russian system versus a East German system versus a American system versus a Canadian system. And I'd be like, wow, how are they all creating results with these different but the thing was, they figured out a way to get things in balance, to appraise the athlete, to appraise, and then they had a system that supported the development. And it looked a little different, but then when you boiled it down, you're like, okay, there's some commonality here. And that where those sorts of systems overlap, I think, is where the sweet spot is for really being able to understand human performance. So that's really cool. And coming back to yourself, like, we see the other language that gets used around ACLs is you call it compensator versus non-compensator. Sometimes in the literature they'll call it copers versus non-copers.
Yep.
And man, I'll tell you right now, like, there seem to be some distinct features of people who can cope, that, as you described, they upregulate all the active restraints around their knee.
Mm-hmm.
And I often say the ACL it handles a couple thousand newtons of force before it ruptures. Like, it's not a high force mechanical restraint, even though it is providing mechanical restraint. It's a proprioceptor. It's got
Mm-hmm.
it's got tons of it. It's the sensory organ. And I guess in some ways, when you think about it in that context, is without your active restraint, your knee, like, your knee needs them. And those are the muscular systems, the fascial system. It's how you create tensions. And having somebody like yourself, when we bring them through the lab and hook them up with EMG and are able to study their regulation of eccentric, concentric muscle actions and jumping and hopping and plyometric ability, it's really interesting, because you nailed it. You adopt movement strategies and ways to optimize despite what you've lost. And that to me is the beauty of the human body, man. It's redundant, and I'm a big believer in that. So it's a cool story to hear you reflect on that.
Craig Bueller, who's a doc in Salt Lake City. We've had him on. He does a deal called AMIT, Activated Muscle Integration Technique, and it's as close to wizardry and sorcery and witchcraft as I've ever seen. And I don't believe in any of that stuff, but I've seen him do things that are absolutely insane. And one of the BJJ guys that I started training about a year ago, Victor Hugo, had a L4, L5. Pretty severe. I mean, to the point where I sent him out to get a DEXA scan. And on the DEXAs where they show the body kind of laying there, I could see the curve. I could see the scoliosis and the curve in the DEXA scan. I didn't have to send him out for an X-ray. And he had a ton of pain. I mean, left calf deteriorated. I mean, as we started kind of moving, I mean, he at some point couldn't even really stand on his feet. Like a month before his biggest fight, was having some real issues. So he comes to me day one, can't tie his shoes, having all this pain, and just assessed pretty early any form of axial loading to shut him down. So he's like, what do we do? I'm like, well, we got to find other ways to load you that don't involve axial loading, but we still have to do some form of x-axis bilateral hinging. And, so we started using a belt squat, just let's put the load, and all of a sudden the neutral hip, and started getting him stronger. And instead of being stuck with different movements, trying to figure out what allowed him to move best. Found that different loading on the Bulgarian split squat at different elevations, elevating the heel. Hatfield Bulgarian single leg stuff was great for him, focusing on rotation, teaching
Yeah.
him trunk stability and to be able to maintain a good
Yeah.
position, teaching him what neutral spine is and neutral hip, just all of the basics. And all of a
Yeah.
sudden, he's like squatting 400 pounds and he can
Yeah.
deadlift and he can do these things, hasn't had any back pain. And,
Yeah.
just it was one of these deals where, he had seen a bunch of different people and they kind of were like, oh, I don't know what to do. And he asked me, and I'm like, well, dude, we're going to, instead of all the people asking you all the things you can't, let's find the
Right.
things you can do and then build
Totally. Yeah.
upon those. And then when you get
Yeah.
real strong, and I told him, I'm like, the reason I was able to play as long as I did and to play at the level I was because I was just really fucking strong. Like I took
Yeah.
a helmet to the shin, broke my fibula clean in half. I mean, they casted it, 5 days, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, I ended up playing and went out and made Madden's horse trailer with a broken leg. And the
Yeah.
deal, and people ask me, I'm like, well, I was pretty strong on one leg and I had a good punch and I could just make
Yeah.
up for it. And I got pretty good pain threshold. But I get really kind of wrapped around the axle and get pretty pissed where coaches are constantly poo-pooing, oh, he can't do this, he can't do this, and can't do
Yeah.
this. Well, let's find out what he can do. Let's build up that base level of strength
Totally.
and build that
Yeah.
platform. So all of a sudden,
Yeah.
we've been training about 9 months. I took him out to see Dr. Bueller, and Dr. Bueller got a bunch of stuff balanced and got him really fucking humming. And Dr. Bueller's like, if you had brought him here 9 months ago before he was strong, none of this work would have been meaningful. But now that
Mm.
you've cleared away and established who he is physically,
Yeah.
added muscle, added function, confidence, got him
Yeah.
out of pain. He's like, my work is so
Yeah.
much more valuable.
Yeah.
And, just increasing a base level of conditioning, pushing them past, being consistent, rotations and throws. And we started putting a
Yeah.
bunch of like strongman, what I call density training, which is that task specific tension, swinging kettlebells, teaching
Yeah.
position,
Yeah.
lots of pulls and throws, awkward implements. And, all of a sudden, now he's one of the top dudes in the world, one of the best in the world when they thought that
Yeah.
maybe this guy'd be done at 25.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it goes back to where I tell people, and this is what we've seen across the program, you can't get stuck doing, and I actually had this conversation with a guy yesterday. He's like, oh, my hip's hurting. I can't squat. I can't do this. I'm like, well, what can you do? I want you to go to the gym
Yeah.
in, 24-hour fitness, and I want you to find
Yeah.
every leg machine. And I want you to
Yeah.
find the one leg machine that there's no pain. And he came
Yeah.
and he's like, oh, I found this one machine that I can do and my quad gets pumped and I feel pretty good. Is it okay? And I'm like, yeah, because you're actually using it. If you have arthritis in
Totally.
your hip and you have some of these issues, the worst thing you can do is not load it. All the research I've seen that
Oh
talks
yeah.
about you want to fight arthritis,
Yeah.
continue to load the joint and make
Yeah.
sure the supporting muscles are as strong.
Hell yeah,
So,
man. Oh
so
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's really fascinating where
Oh yeah.
like people get like, oh, I'm stuck. I guess I'll die. I'm like, dude, as soon as I get stuck, we pivot and we go in a different direction.
Oh yeah.
Or I reach
Yeah.
out to somebody who's smarter than me, or I go and adopt. I mean,
Yeah.
Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do was, discard what's useless, keep what's useful.
Yeah.
And I always tell them, man, don't get stuck in dogma. Just because you're doing one thing today doesn't mean that that's all you have to be. And I see strength coach all the time. Like, this is who we are. This is what we do. Well, what if the
I know.
athlete doesn't work within that system? Like
Yeah.
everybody, and even though we're all not unique snowflakes, to quote Tyler Durden, when you look at athletes at really the top pinnacle, they have a very unique skill set. And your job as a coach is to clear away the rubble and make sure
Yeah.
that, you don't impede them because your ego is such that this is what we do and this is what you have to do.
Yeah. 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 Agreed. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. And I think, the more you, and I've learned this, probably the best teacher of this has been my own personal injuries. And also, when you're dealing with athletes with serious injuries, you must reframe your system. And, it's easy to say this is how we do things when you got young, healthy bucks that are going to respond to nearly anything. And you wait until you've got an athlete, one of our athletes, I'll keep the sport confidential just to protect the person. But, this athlete suffered an injury that, the leg fracture was so bad. Let's just say that the surgeon, had it not been our team surgeon, it's very likely this guy would have had his leg amputated. It was just
Ugh.
horrific. And obviously the surgeon did a tremendous amount of handiwork and was very skilled and was able to, help this individual get to some level of normal anatomy again. And this individual was sort of at the end of their close to the end of their career, but it's just one example of, okay, you're now in a driver's seat to be able to support somebody's rehab, and you're like, okay, I have to rethink everything I know about what I think I know so that I can help this individual.
Yeah.
And what that leads me to is something exactly like you said, is when does that, in Instagram terms, that non-functional exercise, in scare quotes, become a functional exercise, in
I think
scare quotes?
everything's functional.
Hell yeah. Like
Like,
that's
yeah,
exactly, you hit the
yeah.
nail on the head. It's like
I,
exactly like
I,
when your physiology needs it,
yeah,
it's freaking functional, man. Like,
I
yeah,
fucking hate it. Yeah, no, I mean,
yeah,
that's not a functional exercise. And,
that's right.
well, but so this is where this stuff gets kind of mixed. Like training bodybuilders is very different than training athletes. Do athletes need to understand something, or as coaches, if you're training athletes, do you need to understand something about bodybuilding? 100%. Like they figured out how to create a larger cross-sectional size of a muscle. And if a guy comes in who needs to put on muscle and be bigger and stronger, you better know a little classic bodybuilding.
Yeah,
Right. But at the end of the day, I'm not hiring bodybuilders to train my Olympic athletes. The
yeah,
same in football. There was all these power lifters, and they're great in terms of like, hey, my feet are fixed in a bilateral position, and now I'm just going to hinge with a heavy weight and stand up. Like there's very few times when I was playing football that I was ever in that position. Not
yeah,
to say I can't learn something from them, but just being like, oh, we're going to train everybody to do 1 RMs and a squat, bench, and deadlift. Is that going to work? Maybe for some people. For everybody, I don't know. And
yeah,
I remember, Louis Simmons talking about that. He's like, I train powerlifters, but I train athletes. Do we use some of the pieces? Yeah, but at 100%, they're doing a lot of the different stuff. So, I
yeah,
mean, this idea of like not getting stuck in this, like, this is who we are, this is the dogma. And I'm like, shouldn't it be about performance and figuring out what are the limiting factors, but then, never sacrificing who you are or what I call your wheelhouse for limiting factors. Like I remember one of the CrossFit things was like, you should just abandon everything you're good at and only train your weaknesses.
yeah, yeah,
And I was like, you need to walk that one back. Like, yeah, do you
yeah,
need to understand what your weaknesses are? Yeah, but you can never abandon who you are as an athlete, because
totally.
when all of a sudden the pressure's at 100 and you have to do the best, you're going to go back to your wheelhouse, who you are. I know who I was. And that's
Yeah,
another issue too with training high level athletes. So I ask the guys all the time, who are you? What do
yeah,
people know you for? If you had to go to your default, if everything went
yeah,
wrong and you had to go to that one thing, what's the one thing that establishes who you are? What are people
yeah,
100 years from now, if they write a book, what's the one thing that they're going to say about you? Is it art? Is it technique? Is it this? All right. Well, then we have to establish that, and let's fucking pound that in the ground with an iron,
yeah,
nail. And then let's develop everything in concert, but never at the
yeah,
expense of who you are. I was always
totally.
you know, um, big punch. I used my head, fast hands and feet, always stayed inside of a dude's, tried to out athlete him, but I was never going to be a 350-pound road grader. So a lot of times when I go against guys that were 350, 370, I would hit them numerous times. So I'd set,
Yeah.
hit, come back, and I would kind of like jackhammer them. Whereas,
Hmm.
other dudes would get into them and try to move their hips. I'm like, dude, I'm going to get squashed doing this. So like,
Yeah.
in my stuff, there was always a lot of foot speed, a lot of hand speed, a lot of jump rope, a lot of movement.
Hmm.
And, the technique I developed allowed me to do what I needed to do. Whereas, if I had adopted the technique of certain other people, I would have played myself out of a job.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when I start working with athletes, I always ask, like, what do people know you for? Who are you? What do you do better than anybody in the world that's allowed you to be here? Let's bring everything up, but never at the expense.
Yeah.
Victor, the guy that I was working with, he's real good on his back and he can play this bottom game and this guard and he inverted and he does a lot of stuff. I'm like, keep doing it. But now we're going to make
Yeah.
sure you're standing up where if you got to wrestle a dude up, you can slam him.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's an interesting piece in terms of like, working with people, virtually or through the internet and programs and this. I mean, there's a general strength training program that when you're writing it is, pretty good for the middle of the bell curve, and
Yeah.
if people don't fit within it, they're probably going to, taper out into other programs. But when we start talking about training high level athletes, now all of a sudden this is something where you got to see this person and like, okay, who are you and what can you do, and assess them and then figure out like, all right, we're going to go as far as we can. And when it stops, we're going to make a turn. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes, athletes fall into bad situations. They might not be around the right coach, or maybe they're in the wrong philosophy. And, the age old, like, hey, we got to break a lot of eggs to make an omelet. I'm like, dude, those days are kind of behind
Yeah.
us now, but that was kind of the
Yeah.
philosophy. Like when I went to
Totally.
the Philadelphia Eagles, no shade on this. It was Penn State, high intensity, one set to failure on machines. You go in, there was a row of about 20 machines, hammer strength, and we'd sit down, they'd load the weight, and you do one set to failure. And then you go to the next one, the next one, the next one. And I'd come from, you know, um, snatch, clean, and jerk, plyometric, like very like a Russian kind of Eastern Bloc strength coach who was, plyometrics, PAP, a lot of change of direction, snatch, clean, and jerk, front squat. I mean, it was, so I come from that. And I go to this high intensity, one set to failure. And what was wild is I got stronger, probably because the exposure was so different than what I'd done before. But at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
season, they were like, "Hey, when are you coming back?" I'm like, I'm not going to train with the team. I'm going to go down and I found a guy I'm going to train with just because I think even though I did fine, what I did here is going to not allow me to continue to flourish as an athlete. I
Yeah.
still have development. So I went and I trained with this guy, Raphael, and ended up growing in. And then every year they'd come back and be like, "Oh, you didn't make a single off-season workout. These guys did great." And I'd be like, "Perfect. Let's line up and run the conditioning test. We'll see how this thing all pans out." And I killed everything. But
Yeah.
there were guys that program worked great for, but I knew myself as an athlete pretty early on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something I constantly am talking about with power athletes. Any of our athletes, who are you? What do you do better? And more
Oh
importantly,
yeah.
how do I help you clear away the rubble?
Oh
And
yeah. Yeah.
that's where we
That
get into
yeah.
this specificity, within movements. So three guys are training. Everybody, hey, today we got a heavy barbell load. Well, if you can't do that, you're going to do this and this, and trying to move and find how they can train as a group, but also allow each of them to flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. If it's not the first question on my athlete intake form, it's in the top three. But what what do you think makes you good? I want to know that. And I want to know that because those are the things that are uniquely yours. And to that point, I think that there's this, yeah, there's this, like, you gotta, in your evolution as a strength coach or whatever, in whatever capacity you're in, you eventually learn when you're working with top level athletes that you must understand what makes them good. And you can't, like, that's why it is impossible to create a single system when you work with good athletes. I mean, it'll only take you that, and it's one of the reasons why, when I was back in the day and sort of deciding my direction in career, I can remember one good friend of mine who was very entrepreneurial, whose goal was to become a millionaire by the time he was 30. And I was like, well, I'll probably be broke by the time I'm 30, but my goal is to really help these athletes, and understand. And I had a completely different view of what what I wanted to be able to do in my career. And I'll tell you, I had journals, I kept notes at every Olympic Games, I kept detailed sort of descriptions of what was happening. And I started to realize that those top athletes, they know themselves extremely well. They trust in their team. They are very careful about who comes in that circle of trust for being able to help them. And at the end of the day, you will help them the best by being curious about what makes them good. I'm a big believer in that, and that's why it's unfortunate that you can't put that into a package and sell that as a weekend training course. But man, you can teach that system of thinking. And I think that's maybe what the key is. And obviously you're applying that, what you learned as an athlete, and you're applying it with other athletes now. And I was never a great athlete. I was nowhere, I was no NFL player, that's for sure. But I trained hard, and I liked to be an athlete, and I worked hard at it. But then I surrounded myself with lots of different coaches and lots of different athletes over a long period of time to come to the same conclusion. Like,
Yeah.
shit, man, I gotta freaking take a step back here and really think about this. And that's one of the impetuses for me to, when I started using force plates more, and I was looking at trying to measure to see if I could understand what makes you good by measuring the forces when you squat, clean, jump with load, do a plyometric hop. I was starting to try to say, like, can I quantify it? Like, there was this like question I always had. Or is it all just like, you can't measure it, don't even bother. But I think that question of being able to, like, see if we can increasingly fine tune that. I think it's the future. I think it's going to be more and more, if it's not already here in practice, it'll just become more as we've got to, there's just too, um, yeah, there's just too much. If you work anytime in sport, it's just going to be readily, like, right there in your face. You got to treat every athlete according to what their strengths are and what drives them and makes them good. It's just the bottom line. So,
one of the questions that I posed was, I know you're a big force plate guy, and you did a lot of early work with like cheap jump mats, so you could kind of go out and use them with a lot of different coaches. I just, the one thing that for us to do force plates, like I got to reach out to a lady and she's got to show up in a van and bring all of her stuff in, or we got to go to a facility. Yeah. Whereas that technology would be so important, especially for athletes. Let's say they're training in a small group away from their coach, to be able to have those, hey, I need you to do these 3 movements on the mat, so then I, as a coach, I can start tracking progress. Yeah. That's kind of the thing I'm waiting for, is where there's like a cheaper, easier option. I don't, last time I checked, the force plates were kind of a little far outside the realm of like the garage gymmer or the, dad who's training his garage. But, Skudnik kicked me over. He's like, you're definitely the guy to talk to about that.
Well, I mean, um, in a nutshell, I mean, this goes back to the very beginning of the whole story. Is, as a guy who's always been interested in science and a guy who's always been interested in practice, I always was troubled by the fact that I couldn't marry those two up very well. It was like the science just didn't apply in practice.
Yeah.
And the practice just wasn't aligned with the science. I was like, oh frick, man, what a conflicting place to be in. These things just can't fit together. And I was moving along, and I think the big reason that I was so struggling so much is that I had everything I was using as a tool was always measuring the same sort of construct, which was some aspect of how you performed. So even with the jump mat, it was like, well, how high did you jump? And then, it was a timer. How fast did you run? How much did you lift? Or how big are your legs? And I started to realize that it was like, yeah, stuff's all kind of just sort of like, doesn't really give me a whole lot more information. And as a person who had done some done a master's of science and had published a couple papers and had been around the science side, I was like, these force plates would sure be useful, but man, they're just too much work to implement, as you say. And when I first got my hands on a set of force plates that were about $1,000, from a company called Pasco, which is a company that provides kind of like, basically lab equipment for high school physics classes.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh shit, this is great. These are these little squares that are about a foot by a foot, and they seem to do a pretty good job. And so I bought a couple. They were $500 each, and I started to realize that the force plate, when I looked at the forces, it was almost the manifestation of everything we've been talking about in this conversation. Is everything you do, how you create tension in your body and use your body as a system, it manifests in the energy you put into the ground on some level. Now, of course, there's other dimensions to this, because there's energy that you're putting in multiplanar space all the time. But a big part of it is how you put energy in the ground. I mean, this is the best example to me. Is I used to, through training mixed martial artists and whatnot, I trained boxing for several years myself with a boxing club, and the coach there, Doug Harder, would always say, again, some old quote, but he's like, 70% of your punching power comes from your feet and what you put in the ground. And so, we know that there's this anchor point. And so when I started getting the force plates and started using them in practice, I was like, holy shit, there's a force signature here that was showing up around squatting, cleaning, jumping. And I was able to sort of now like understand a little bit more about what athletes were putting into the ground. Um, and it was very eye-opening because I often say, like, I don't use a force plate to look at performance per se. I look at it to understand how you apply force. So it's the strategy, I guess you could say, or the kit, the way you're doing it, which I've always been really interested in. So it was an invaluable tool which I stumbled upon as a real lucky slash not planned sort of thing. I got those plates for $500, which were cheap. Brought them back. I had them set up in the gym, and it was like, I mean, for lack of a better word, it was like a garage gym. It was a basement gym at our Olympic Training Center. There was no
Wow.
tech, no budget, no nothing, but it was very useful. And I think now the technology is a little bit more commercial. Like you can buy force plates from a couple of different companies. They have turnkey solutions for giving you sort of data outputs.
Hmm.
So it's become much more widespread. I don't know very many professional sports teams or collegiate teams that don't have a set of force plates now.
Sure.
But we're still in that phase of a lot of times people just don't know how to use them,
Yeah.
and that's often where they come to someone like me, is that I, as a strength coach, I used them. So I didn't just research on them, although now I research on them and I try to study this stuff. But as a strength coach, I just used them as a tool. And I found them to be one of the most valuable tools I've ever come across, which is to say not the only thing, but it's like, I'm not trying to say it's the only thing you need, but it certainly is a cool aspect of understanding human performance at the level we've been talking about, which is how do you do it? So if I had you in the gym, and let's say I was your strength coach, I would be like, okay, what is he doing on that injured leg, a previously injured leg? I would want to see how you create plyometric stiffness, how you create power, how you create high force and high strength movement. And again, the way that you organize yourself to create that, we see it in a reflection in that force time curve. And so, what I found is, like, it's a really valuable way to help me guide what a big aspect of how I'm training people is, helping them to be more effective in that domain.
So
Um,
with like the curves, I mean, how do you delineate between like force, power, and strength? That's something that, when you look at the force plates, and we've played with them, and I think the what people are hoping for is like, hey, I think when we were years ago, we were out at in Philly, and we went and visited the guy at Penn, and he was using like Sparta Science, where they're using
yeah,
force plates, and you jump, and then it like gives you
yeah,
a program, hey, this person's 70% on this side, 30 here, and I thought it was fascinating. But that was only limited by whatever their algorithm is and how they've designed it and this other
yeah,
stuff. And I looked at it
yeah,
like, I want to see the raw data, but then at the end of the day, um, what does the data tell me? And more importantly, how do I make these tweaks as a coach? And whenever people have asked
yeah,
me, I'm like, I think you have to get the data, you have to make the tweaks that you think, and then you retest and you retest and you see if it's going in the right direction. And that,
right.
there's different hallmarks, but I think that was the biggest one, is like, is this going to tell me if I need to be, I always defined power as your ability to display your strength dynamically.
Hmm.
And I found people where, their strength was far outmatching the power. I mean, I've told the story before, but we brought in a guy when I was in Philly, and I watched a guy bench 585 for a triple before
Hmm.
practice. I mean, he looked like $1 million. He couldn't play dead. He stood straight up. We hit him in his
Yeah.
chest, tea kettled him. They actually took him and cut him before practice was over. They were like, "You're going to get hurt out here." I mean, the dude had a 600-pound bench press. He was, 290 pounds. And they
Yeah.
were like, "You're going to get fucking killed out here. You need to go." And they ended up cutting him before we left practice. And like, people
Wow.
are fascinated. You're like, that guy's got a 600-pound bench. He should be able to play. And I'm like, he couldn't use his hips. His feet were stuck. He was stiff as a board. Like, he couldn't absorb load. He couldn't redirect. He couldn't do this stuff. And he's, I mean, other big, strong dudes that have all these skills are going to fucking wreck this dude and shatter him into a million pieces.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so with the force plates, I'm interested in, like, when the information comes out, like, it's almost like a tuning an EQ. Like, I got to
Yeah.
turn this and this and this and adjust. But I wonder
Yeah.
how it delineates, and more importantly, as a strength coach or as a coach that's looking at that information, how do you decide which direction to go?
Yeah. I mean, I, I think the short answer is that we can see a simplistic level, but in the weight room with vertical movements. So I'm just going to focus on that. I'm not going to touch on like multi-directional change of direct. If you're talking about like making cuts and stuff, we'll just leave that all to the side. So anything you can measure up and down in the sagittal plane. What is valuable is we can load people up and we can examine and look and see how they generate force under load. And so that's one of my favorite tests is to have, whether it's forms of either trap bar counter movement jumping, trap bar squat jumping, trap bar clean pulls, trap bar deadlift. You put people on force plates and you have them, move the load, and you can see the load they move. So that in and of itself, you can delineate somebody who's strong versus not strong, just like your dude with bench press, right? It's like, oh yeah, the guy's freaking strong. He can bench 600 pounds. The dude is strong. He can deadlift, you know, 700 pounds, take whatever outcome measure you want. But with a force plate, I can now see dynamically how you manage the load. So when you say absorb, I can measure your ability to absorb that external load, that external energy, right? When you decelerate that mass. So your force plate is now a tool that lets you look at how you unload, how you break that load, or how you dissipate that energy, and then how you couple that to create propulsion. So that ability to unload, break, and create propulsion are easily measured with a force plate. And so if I take you under a high load condition, and I take you under a moderate load condition, and then I take you with just your body weight, and then I take you in a very rapid hop style movement or a drop jump, I've got a full spectrum now of how you manage load in your ability to absorb energy and create propulsion. And I can create a picture about which aspect of that needs to be pulled up or down.
Mm.
And so, you'll see individuals who create, I use this example of again, I won't use the sport just out of respect for this athlete, but the individual had a full knee dislocation and a horrible, sport injury. And their return to sport timelines were like, we're not talking 12 months to get back to sport. We're talking like 2 years, right? The best data I had at the time, I had 3 other athletes with full knee dislocations, and athletes at 12 months post surgery looked like athletes who were about maybe 8 weeks post surgery after a normal injury.
Well,
This guy
that's one of those
yeah,
things when the kneecap pops out, ends up, I can't remember the little ligament that tears, that keeps the knee tracking. But when that knee dislocates and that kneecap pops out, I mean, that's a
yeah.
tough injury to come back from, because the
Well, and just
kneecap.
to be, sorry, it just, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that patellar dislocation
Yeah.
is a gnarly,
Well, when you said it,
injury.
I kind of almost threw up in my mouth because I've seen it happen.
Yeah,
And it's one of those things where, I tore my patellar tendon and the retinaculum
yeah,
tore, so my kneecap
yeah,
moved over, but my kneecap didn't dislocate. It just
yeah,
moved out
yeah,
because the retinaculum wasn't there to keep it, so they stitched it back and
yeah,
I was fine. But the guys that I saw where the kneecap dislocated and that muscle teared
yeah.
and that lack of stability, they would have to like tape it in place, hope to God that it would stay, and it continued to
Oh
happen.
yeah,
And it ended up being one of those things that ended a
yeah.
lot of guys' career. It was kind of one and done.
Oh yeah, yeah. And so, just sorry if I hope this doesn't actually make you vomit in your mouth, because
No,
this
it was the
guy,
proverbial.
not
I've seen a
only,
lot of bad shit.
yeah, not only did this guy do what you just described,
Yeah.
but he tore every ligament in his knee.
Mm.
PCL, ACL, MCL, LCL, patellar tendon, all gone. He was
I,
he was he
downhill
was a
skier.
full
It's got to be a downhill skier, because it's the only
a
people I've ever seen
full
wreck at fucking 90 miles an hour and their legs go helicopter and you see the knees
oh
spin. Yeah.
it was a horrendous uh and it's, as I said, in my career as a strength coach, I've only had 3 or 4 individuals who suffered these full complete dislocations of the knee. But why I'm bringing this up, and it is going to tie back to the force plate, is gym strength. This guy right away, right out of the gate, this person, the surgeon was remarking like, holy cow, their healing ability is unreal.
Mm.
Like it was incredible. I think lots of people were very surprised at how well that was going. And I was really amazed that at about, a time frame where I would have expected that person to still be sort of like early phases of it all. they actually set a power clean personal best. It
Wow.
was like, holy shit, wow, it's unbelievable. But when we put them on a force plate and we gave them extra load, it was really clear that their propulsion ability was really good. But what they were missing was that ability to create braking forces. So, you were describing your guy with the 600-pound bench who couldn't create a braking force. Now, there's probably a few reasons. A, he's standing stiff. B, he's not in good position. B, he doesn't know how to use his hip.
Yeah.
But as the capacity of creating braking force pertains to, like, I bet you if I put a bar on off your hip and I'd compared your braking force ability to this guy's, and let's say it was like, hey, the task is I'm going to put 95% of your body mass on this trap bar, or 100% of your body mass. So you got 290 to manage, and this guy's got, or he's got 290, you got 310. You probably had an ability to create stiffness in your system to take that extra load and bring it to a stop with this incredible rate of force development and incredible timing, right? Um, so in this particular scenario, that's where a force plate becomes really valuable, because with this example of this athlete I'm giving you, the gym numbers would have incorrectly led you to say this person's ready to rock and roll because they look so strong in these traditional movements. But
Sure.
it was this nuance of breaking forces that they were missing. And your example with your football player example is another one. But that's what a force plate will really let you do, and you can see that. And what I normally do is I break down the deceleration and propulsion phases across a load continuum, and I examine them in and of themselves, which allows me to say, how is the base strength capacity, but how is their ability to absorb, and how is their ability to generate propulsion relative to each other across this load continuum? And how I use it is to be able to, exactly like you said, understand where this person needs to be on that continuum. Sometimes I call it an envelope of function, but
Sure.
where do they need to be, and what aspects do we need to upregulate or downregulate? As, let's just clarify, one component of the things that make people able to express that on the field. So if I can get that up to the right level, and then once we have the foundational performance factor, I can help you use it more effectively in your environment with all the aforementioned tools, whether it's med ball work or on field work or on mat work. It's just now a tool that helps me track these umbrella or these foundational factors underneath the umbrella of strength, helps me track them and better understand them. So my program might look much more geared toward athletes with higher amounts of braking force movements with different positions and postures and loads, or athletes who might have more, like you said, more PAP oriented propulsion, strategies to create more, better power and rate of force development. But it's just now a tool to really help you track those things. I think in its simplistic form, but I think it's a real valuable component.
I heard a statement the other day, and I don't know if I can quantify this. The guy that said it's kind of a, I don't know. I mean, maybe charlatan, maybe I don't know. I think his name is like Gary Brudder, but he made an interesting point that by the time somebody turns 30, he said by the time the population turns 30, 95% of the people will never sprint again.
Hmm.
And that was kind of an interesting pace. And he talked about, sprinting, regardless whether or not you do it or not, is still one of the most neurologically demanding things. I can tell a
Yeah.
ton about an athlete just by watching them take a few steps and sprint, how they come out
Yeah.
in this. And it's one of those skills that if you don't sprint,
Yeah.
it's a perishable skill.
Yeah.
But you also have to be strong enough to sprint and reduce
Right.
force in this. So it's pretty interesting. And this is, I heard the quote, or I think I heard the sound bite, and I thought, shit, man, that's a pretty interesting one. And we still do, we do heavy sled pushes. And I have here in Texas, I graded the hill in the back of our building as it kind of goes flat and then it goes up. So I have about a 30-yard hill run that I graded
Mm.
specific for this, because the old adage, I've never seen anybody run uphill poorly.
Mm.
But one of the things I noticed, and so I heard this quote, I think it was a few days ago when I went to JITS, and whenever we warm up, I always do some, running around. And so what I do is I kind of dog it a little bit on the smaller side. And then I hit the corner and I sprint as fast as I can to the long side. And then I kind of, jog the corners, and it's a pretty big mat. But it's pretty interesting. I started trying to goad people into sprinting the same way, where I was like, hey, I'm going to go this. I want you to try to race me. And it was pretty amazing because there's dudes over the age of 30 and some of the guys, maybe 30s or 40s. It was pretty amazing to see how many people were uncomfortable with sprinting. And more
Yeah.
importantly, when you ask them to put their foot in the ground, not like, getting forward lean, I'm going to get an arm swing. I'm going to try to, get my knee up and, drive, and all the sprint mechanics that I learned through my entire life and something that I continue to cultivate, all of a sudden come back. And then seeing how many people that probably have never done this stuff try to sprint and all of a sudden look like a runaway beer truck. But it's and I was trying to tell people yesterday, I'm like, hey, dude, by the age of 30, people stop sprinting. And if your
Yeah.
ability to sprint might be the greatest determining factor you can have for
Yeah.
longevity and muscle and strength and all this other stuff. So why don't we all sprint? And trying to like coax these dudes into it. And then, but it was just this funny thing. And then thinking about it, prepping for this podcast, I remember being like, man, I would love to take certain people, untrained versus trained in this and be able to do like a huge cross section on the force mats, because jujitsu is interesting. It's, there's certain guys, and your game ends up developing. It's not like boxing where, hey, I got to stand. And I boxed from the time I was 10 to like 14. And then when I went to college, or actually in high school as well, and then on the Cal boxing team in the off season. And then, Raphael, who trained me, he was Antonio Tarver's fight coach. And so we did a bunch of stuff. And so, yeah, it's something like, and it's still my favorite sport. I mean, I'm obsessed with watching boxing just because for me, it's one of the greatest displays of athleticism, two guys standing there, toughness, conditioning, training. I mean, everything gets pulled away because it's just you in a set of shorts with gloves and you got to knock this dude down. But jiu-jitsu is fascinating because there's so many different styles. And, some guys are guard players, some guys do this, they like, want to wrestle, and there's all these different styles, and you basically put them in and guys do what they're good at. And it might not be what you like and whatnot, but I'm trying to start this revival of guys. I'm like, hey, if we're going to come here, there has to be something outside. And when I got done with class last night, I talked to a guy who's, in his late 40s, and he's like, man, I need to start lifting weights. I need to start training. Where do I start?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, we have to start, but like we have to start slow. And like you're gonna have to build your conditioning. We got to build your strength, and then we're going to get to a point where you're going to have to sprint or push something heavy, at least get your knee over your toe. And that's the other one with the heavy sled pushes. I've found such value. What the hell's up with this mic? Because now there's no eccentric load. I don't have to worry about people getting hurt pushing a sled. But I can still get them in that same position. But in this interesting piece of like, it's really fun to work with high level athletes. That's like that's the shit I get up for. But there's such a small amount of these individuals at the top that, but then there's all these people that are former athletes that continue to train and they need to, because that's the greatest chance for longevity. I mean, like if you can lift weights and train and, Wolf's Law under stress and, continue to keep this athletic mindset, I believe longevity is on the other side of this thing.
I think so too. Yeah, I really think so. I'll say this much as well, that you might be interested to know that a lot of my work with force plates actually originates, like how we break down a force time curve, how we look at stretch shortening cycle function, how we look at muscle power, how we look at rate of force development capacity, actually has its roots in aging studies. And it was research done in Denmark, Scandinavia, where they were looking at older adults, and they were looking at like what predicts your functionality when you're 80, when you're 90. And it's so interesting to note that muscle power and rate of force development capacity are better predictors of your functionality with age than almost any other mechanical variable. And you start to see that older adults who maintain some level of muscle power, older adults who train muscle power, older adults who train rate of force development capacity can improve it across the lifespan. And it's not only changes in the muscle, there's changes in the brain, there's changes at all levels of the system that promote better function. And I think the problem is we have never really put an eye on this, because in strength training, it's been dominated over the course of 2 centuries by either circus sideshow freaks who lift crazy weights and it's entertaining, bodybuilding culture, powerlifting culture, and
which are both extreme and weird. I like, I
Yeah,
mean,
totally. Yeah.
I always appreciated bodybuilding for one, the attention to detail, the diet, the training, the knowledge, all
Yeah,
that. I
me
mean,
too.
but as
Me
a
too.
culture, it's fucking weird. You're getting up
Hmm.
in your undies and they're painting you with stuff, and like, a couple years we went to the Arnold and the Mr. Olympia. We did some work with those groups, and we got a chance to
Yeah.
go and seeing the
Yeah.
culture like at that ground level. I'm like,
Yeah.
fuck, dude, this is strange.
Yeah.
And like, but then also taking a 10,000 foot view and realizing like these people are manipulating their body in really interesting ways for a certain effect.
Totally.
So
Totally.
as a, let's say a mechanic of physicality, like, I'm trying to build athletes similar to race cars, and then there's other, cars that come in that, aren't race cars, that are maybe off-road vehicles, or maybe
Yeah.
just old
Yeah.
cars that need to stay up. I mean, all these
Yeah.
different, mechanics don't necessarily pick what they work on, but they're
Yeah.
all within these organisms. And, being able to understand that, the greatest predictor of longevity is muscle mass. The person that may maintain whenever,
Yeah.
they look at like, old people fall, break a hip, and all of a sudden they're bedridden, and that's kind of the end of them because they don't have enough muscle mass to be able to,
Yeah. Yeah.
like they don't have enough currency to be able to, not only get back to training, but get out. I mean, they're stuck in bed for 5 or 6 weeks,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden that's the end of them. But
Yeah.
also in those foreign countries, what I do like about Sweden and Finland and these other countries is people are definitely much more outdoorsy.
Yeah.
So you get people in their 60s and 70s that still cross country ski and do athletic things because that's the culture.
Hmm.
Whereas it's not necessarily the culture here in America. I mean, maybe different in Canada. Um, but it's one of these things where, like if your greatest predictor of longevity is muscle, you need to know how to keep it. You need to know a little
Yeah.
bit of hypertrophy, but then
Yeah.
also be dynamic and strong enough to survive a
Totally.
fall or a tumble.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly, man. Yeah. That's totally it. And it's like everything that you and I have talked about today is going into the nuance of things that you can only feel as an athlete yourself, and you can only observe when somebody displays athleticism. So it's that idea that like what I can see on the outside, if you walk in and you're 290 pounds shredded, I can see that, but I can't see the degree to which you can display these other qualities unless you're engaging in something dynamic with another human or something in your environment. And my viewpoint is that that's the space where we really start to talk now about what separates great athletes. It's really what sort of separates how you do things. I think it's a big, it's not even what I think. The data suggests and supports that those are big predictors of your ability to withstand a slip or a trip. And they're things that we don't train necessarily, right? Because when you train, unless you're an athlete working with somebody like yourself, you think that, well, I'm a 40-year-old person who just wants to lift. So I hypertrophy, I train for hypertrophy, or I train for the stuff I can see. I think that's where something like sprinting really comes in, because it's that braking force ability, it's that fast force. Sprinting encapsulates all that stuff together in one movement. But I think that I think it's a very underrated um, uh, type of training that more of us should put in there. And if you can't sprint, there's still lots of ways
Yeah.
to create braking RFD and power in your training. And it's something that has way more application than just for the athlete. You know what I mean? Like we all should be incorporating that a bit. And I completely agree that you expand a skill set. It's like I often say, it's like I'm trying to give you the tools, not for you to survive on your best day, but for you to survive through the worst day. The worst thing that can happen, you've got the strength, capacity, and the tools to get yourself out of that problem.
Yeah.
I think you put sprinting right there at the top of life skills, man. Like, you don't want to be the last person running out of the camp when there's a bear chasing you. You want to
Yeah.
be able to have,
You just got to be faster than the slowest dude. But I mean,
yeah,
I can't think of a single time in my life where being strong didn't benefit me.
yeah, yeah,
Like there's been numerous things where, stupid things like, I'm in, pull up in traffic and there's a car stuck in the middle of the road and the poor person's sitting in there with their head down because they don't know what to do. And you get that knock on the window and it's like, I'll push, you steer. And like the amount
yeah,
of people I've pushed out of traffic is to the
yeah,
point where it's actually something I'm like, ooh, and to get to help another person. And
yeah,
just for the mere fact that I like to get out and in a moment's notice still provide And am I doing it to be, I don't know, a good Samaritan? Maybe, but I'm really doing it for my own ego, for the fact that I want to know I can get out of traffic and still push a fucking car where it needs to go. And when
Yeah,
somebody
yeah,
else is defeated and in the car and they don't know what to do in this, I mean,
yeah,
get out and some dude just knocks on the window. It's like, you steer, I'll push. Do you need help? No, I
yeah,
got you. And
yeah, yeah,
that piece of whether it be, just anything like that, physicality and the ability to have the strength or the skill or whatever to, I
yeah,
don't know, to defend yourself or lift or do whatever these things.
right.
I don't know. Uh, like that's something that's so defining. So I mean, we get into this interesting piece where now you kind of shape your identity around this, and like
Yeah,
this is something where once an athlete, always an athlete. Like I'm a former professional athlete, and some of the jokes I make where people are like, "Oh, you're more of a coach now," and I'm like, I'm just more of a good athlete that can help other good athletes. So if you want to think of me as a coach, but I haven't necessarily done that 100%. But I still train with our guys, when they come in, not every single day, but if it works with me, and I still, push them in this, and some days I get smashed, some days I smash them. But I
yeah,
think you have to continue to stay competitive and push yourself. And just that sprinting thing last night was so funny for me, just watching these guys run, and I'm seeing all this like Steven Seagal side to side, and
yeah,
people
yeah,
couldn't get the legs up and this, and I was like, dude, like we should just basically get some bands, teach you a little bit of high knee resisted running just to
yeah,
try to get this stuff
yeah,
up. But then also realizing that maybe people don't have the tissues for it. Like
right.
you talked about, stretch shortening cycle, rate of force, you talked about stiffness. I mean, all these factors that all
Yeah,
of a sudden become like we talked about, clearing away the rubble and become very
yeah,
apparent, where if they haven't trained this stuff and the tissue isn't ready, now all of a sudden you get Achilles tears and hamstring pulls and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
techniques dog shit where you get tired and all of a sudden you get a horizon change and pull a hamstring when you start reaching, all these pieces. And so as I was talking to this guy, and he's like, and I told him, like, you got to lift weights and you got to sprint. He's like, well, how do I learn to sprint again? I'm like, probably have to push a sled until you
Yeah,
feel that you've done enough, and we've got a base level conditioning, maybe a little plyometric stuff, little jumps, just so that we can work on that,
yeah, yeah,
reaction, and then get you back into a position where now you're able to do
yeah,
things. Because
totally.
you get to this point, and this is something that hit me when I retired from the NFL. We were still training. I was working with CrossFit and, traveling and doing this. And so we were still in this kind of athletic paradigm, and it was a
Yeah,
different type of thing. People were still running and moving, and we were still training. And then all of a sudden you kind of get into this thing. Like you said, you get to an age and you're like, oh, I'm just going to go do bodybuilding, like
yeah, I know.
hypertrophy. I just want to look good.
Yeah,
But then all of a sudden a little piece of you dies, where all of a sudden
yeah,
now I got to like sprint or run or pick something up and throw. And you realize, like, dude, I've been an athlete my entire life, not to shit on bodybuilding like we talked about, but
yeah,
I've never seen those guys do anything that I would say was an incredible display of athleticism, even though, not to say they can. I'm sure Ronnie Coleman can do a backflip, but being able to go out and continue to progress, because
yeah.
it's like a car. If you don't go out and drive it, and it's just
I know.
tires are going to deflate, the motor's not going to start, you're
Yeah,
going to have all these problems. But we've kind of got
totally.
into this idea where like, oh, that's what younger people do, or
Yeah,
that's those other people. Whereas, I'd love to start a change in mindset of like, the everyday athlete, everybody's an athlete. You have to be an athlete forever. And athletes do
yeah,
things that display athleticism.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's where I think
yeah.
the force plates are so fascinating, where now it's going to be like, hey, you've been lifting weights and you've been doing this. I mean, you got a 70% on one side and on the other. Like, we got to fix these things. Maybe there's a little unilateral training. Maybe we use these as
Oh
better
yeah.
drivers.
Yeah, 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 totally. And I mean, I think I think that's part of the issue, right? Is that you, I think in general, we don't change, and I mean, I'm saying this very carefully, but we don't change what we don't measure on some level. And even though you're not actually measuring it, I can see the results of hypertrophy training.
Yeah.
I can see the results of strength development in the gym. You can't see the results of not sprinting anymore until you are required to do something like that. You can't see the result of not being dynamic and being able to create multi-directional movements until you need to do it.
Yeah.
And so, my viewpoint is, I couldn't agree more about that athleticism piece. And I mean, I'm going to be the first to say, like, at my stage in life, a big part of what I like to do in the gym is to train for, and it's not even for hypertrophy. It's more to say, my goal is to do higher volumes of training, and I'm not trying to push for PRs anymore. But the types of training that I do, they are incomplete if I'm not going in the gym on a weekly basis and hitting the heavy bag and skipping and working on some head movement and working on my
Yeah.
hand-eye coordination and doing some plyos. And I have a session, I have every Saturday I dedicate towards that type of training. It's just like, you know what, going in the gym and I'm going to move like an athlete. And yeah, I'm not power snatching 100 kilos like I used to, not even close. But there's still lots of components of training I do that allow me to express that quality.
Hmm.
I'm just doing it in different ways, and I think that that's sort of the thought is that yeah, there may be some, you know, there may be different benchmarks that you define for yourself when you're an athlete and when you're in those days, but it doesn't mean that when you're done being an athlete, those qualities cease being important. In fact, I think they're extremely important. And when you start neglecting them, I think that that's where, you know, as you said before, these qualities tend to be things that they have a shelf life, and if you're not using them, you're going to lose them. So you got to be up on them. And I noticed, like, when I'm doing weekly boxing sessions and I'm skipping rope and I'm doing sprints and doing things, I actually feel so much more dynamic. Like, and not even that I'm using it, I just know it's there if I need it.
Sure.
And whether that's going to come up in a scenario where you've got to defend yourself, or it's got to be like, I was walking the other day with a friend who slipped on some ice, and I like was just reactive enough to be able to grab them and help them from falling. Like, my reaction time is not something I want to lose. My
Yeah.
speed of movement is not something I want to lose. I want to be able to maintain some level of that across my lifespan, because I think that as soon as that's gone, man, that's like, it's a psychological thing. Like, you don't have it. We see it with injury. Like, in that stage of injury where you're like, you've lost something, your system constrains your strategies because you don't have what you need. And so you're trying to expand a solution space to create movement. These move like that to me is the foundation of training. It's like, you have a solution space, I need to expand it. Injury restricts it, aging restricts it, detraining restricts it, and when you've lost it, we want to fill it up again. And I view that as like an essential part of maintaining your confidence across the lifespan. Even if you don't think it matters, when you've lost that, you immediately start constraining what you can do. And maybe down the road, it's the thing that says, hey, you know what? I don't think I can do this activity anymore because I just don't have that. I'm with you on that for sure.
So what are you currently working on with your research?
We have two main projects going on. The first one is I'm really interested in studying what happens in individuals who have ACL injury after they get back to sport and they're quote unquote back. So
Mhm.
this is like 12 months to 5 years. And what I'm really interested in trying to understand is, what are the things that help predict an athlete's ability to get that step back to where they were. And I'm using this again as a colloquial, but like, you lose a step after that injury and you don't feel like you've got that step or that reaction that people feel. But what I see is more that you've lost the ability to create these sort of like joint stiffening strategies and plyometric stiffness, which support all these things. So one big piece of our research right now, and it's a PhD student named Zach McLean who's leading this up, is we're using a longitudinal study design to try to understand what factors determine that return to performance readiness. And so it's a monumental amount of work, but even trying to understand something simple as, do you experience training load the same way as somebody who's never had an ACL injury after you've had one? I think that's a question. I don't know what the answer is. Like, at 12 months post surgery, if you had an ACL injury, do you experience training the same way you used to, or the same way somebody who's at your counterpart who doesn't have that injury? We have a lot of unanswered questions there that I think could help us in that retraining for performance phase. So that's a big one. And then the second thing that we're really interested in exploring is, I have always been absolutely fascinated by how muscles work eccentrically. And I've been fascinated about how people regulate exactly what you describe is like their ability to absorb energy. Like you've said
Yeah.
it about 10 times in this conversation that that's something that is like this thing,
Yeah.
magic thing that you see.
Dude,
And
it's been the difference between somebody who can do it at a high level for a long time and somebody that can't. Their ability
yep,
to absorb and actually that accentuation phase to be able to absorb force and then basically rebound that force and then use it in meaningful ways
yep,
to be able to redirect it. I would
yep,
see guys take blows. And it was almost as if like there was and the only like I go back to this thing with task specific tension that
yep,
you have to be and we can talk in boxing because you box, but that idea where like I'm fairly loose and as I punch and then at the last minute I snap and I create
yep,
this tension to knock somebody out. You're not just some people do, they throw Tyson Fury, you see him kind of throw that like slap hand, but if you're going to throw a punch it has to if you're here the whole time, but that like
yep,
task specific tension, same thing if you're going to take a body shot, like you
yep,
can't tense up, but you have to create, there has to be a certain amount of tension where if you get hit and you're not expecting it, you don't fucking all of a
yep,
sudden just get buckled.
yep,
So
yep,
that task specific tension, I mean, we teach it in everything, whether it be, any of the like the oscillation stuff or whether it be
yep,
kettlebells or any of the swings
yep,
where I have to,
yep,
create tension, generate force, let it float, and then come back down and be able to rebound it.
right.
With it being, plyometrics or jumps or any of the triple stuff. I mean, I'm constantly looking for ways to teach people to absorb force and
Yeah,
then
I know.
rebound
Yeah,
and use that force
yeah,
and their
yeah,
ability to do that. Like, I think that's all I need to say. Like, I've had a bunch of people over the years. Had a dad recently, a guy I know, his son's going to go play big Division 1 football, and he asked me, he's like, "Can I bring my kid in?" I'm like, "Bring him. I'll tell you within 10 minutes whether he can play at the high next level or not." I've
right,
had
right,
numerous people bring, had a 16 mom reach out with bring a 16-year-old kid over, and within 10 minutes, I'm like, if he stays healthy and gets big and strong, he has a chance to go play
right.
just because he has a certain skill set. One, he's coachable. Hey, this is a position, and taught him some of the nuance. Put your big toe on the ground, drive the knee out, rotate this. Kid did it all. And I was like, he moves really well and he does all the things that I like to see. And so there's these kind of hallmark pieces,
Yeah, yeah,
because like I said, like that was what I was good at. You run up to the line, you assess guys, you see this guy can do this and this. I know what he likes to do. Now I'm going to take it away from him with my skill set.
right.
And a big part of that assessing athletes, and we've seen, is their ability to be able to absorb and basically like take this force and then be able to use it, because it's not all
Yeah,
just punching. If that was the
yeah, yeah,
case, it doesn't work like that, especially in these combat sports and in boxing. I mean, everybody throws a great punch. Can you take a
yeah,
punch? And more importantly, can you counter off of that punch? Which,
right.
you see guys get knocked out. I mean, I was watching some clips yesterday. I have a friend who's a boxing fanatic. He sent me a clip, and it was actually of Fedor, with that little like step back hook that he has, that he's knocked so
Yeah,
many
yeah,
people out, where he takes the punch and is literally uses the force of the punch to have him backstep and then hits with that left hook and knocks people out.
yeah,
So he was teaching a guy they were just in the gym teaching it, and he was showing
yeah,
it how he did it. And then they went to all the clips that he'd knocked people out with. And there was one where he took a massive punch and the punch actually drove him back and he pivoted and knocked the dude out with the deal. I mean, he took a hell of a
yeah,
shot, but he had the ability.
yeah,
He knew he was going to take that shot and he was going to use that force to pivot. It's fucking amazing.
yeah. That's it.
I I am such I mean, the people on the podcast can be like, shut the fuck up again. But in terms of like boxing and combat and like, I do love the UFC and MMA, and the jiu-jitsu's been a lot of
Yeah,
fun. But at the end of the day, like I am such a boxing fan. Like I love
yeah.
it. I'll
Me too.
watch it all the time. I mean,
Yeah,
Francis Ngannou fighting against Tyson Fury was like, I mean, just amazing to see a guy that has no experience as a professional boxer go in and put one of the best heavyweights in history on his fucking ass and shock the
yeah,
world like that. I mean, that was
yeah,
unbelievable. And now that guy, now they're trying to do these hybrid this and this. And I'm like, it's great, but I want to see, Tyson took him in, like let him train as a boxer for 2 years and let me see what he can do. So no,
yeah, yeah.
I'm
Totally.
such a fan of the fight game. Always have been.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, no, absolutely. And I think it's just one of those environments where when you when you don't appreciate it, as the sweet science that it is, like you don't realize how much timing and position and also ability to create angles is like that is what the greats do. It punching hard is as much your angle and your speed and your timing as it is anything else. And yeah, I think there's a whole middle zone of like what makes those individuals good. Can we see it? Can we? Sometimes it feels like it's just like you can't actually put a number to that. But that's one of the big things in my research program right now is trying to figure out how you can measure that commonality. Like, is there something about people who are good at this, no matter what domain you're in,
Mm-hmm.
that really starts to quantify a new dimension of how we can look at strength. I'm super interested in that. I mean, like we said it all throughout the conversation. It's like there's strength. Strength is foundational. You and I both agree. Strength is a foundation for supporting so many things in life. I fully believe that, performance included, in athletic performance. But then there exists the decoupling between strength and performance that is now all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And we feel it, we see it, we know what it's like to train it, we know what it's like to lose it. We know what it's like in expressed in different environments. But man, I'd really like to understand that more. Like, what is it about? What is it about training, and what is it about somebody's characteristics that make them good at that? The fascinating topic to me.
Well,
So
you've seen it with the ACLs. The amount of individuals that I've like I said, I tore my ACL. They did a surgery, and my rehab was dog shit. I mean, it was in the 90s. The ATCs were doing it. Like, it just wasn't good, and it took me a full year. They pushed me back too fast. I mean, it was like, I look back and it was just so poorly done. It wasn't until a year later we got a new strength
yeah,
coach, and he's like, man, like, we got to put you in Ollie's shoes. We got to get your knees over your toes. You got to get positive shin angle when you squat. If you don't do that, you're never going to strengthen your quad. You're never going to put yourself in the
yeah,
position, because, when you sprint, your knee is always over your toe, positive shin angle. And at the end of the day, you
yeah,
get paid to run, not lift weights. So,
yeah,
we were doing
yeah,
this kind of wide vertical shin, power lifter, sit back
yeah,
squat.
yeah,
And they were
yeah,
coaching me, and they were like, and if you think about sheer force in this, I wish, and this is funny. I talked to my mom yesterday, and she's like, if you could have anything for Christmas, we were just making jokes. I'm like, I would wish a transporter time machine so I could go back
yeah,
me now and talk to the young John Wellborn at certain points to fucking guide
yeah,
him
yeah,
to a better deal. That 20-year-old kid, 26 in different points, and she's like, oh yeah, wouldn't we all, right? But the one thing that's fascinating with ACL tears, different than any other injury I've ever come across, is you meet people post surgery. And I've heard this
hmm
over and over again. It just doesn't feel right. I don't
yeah,
feel the same. And they become so
yeah,
fixated on it being
yeah,
different. And my whole
yeah,
deal was, when I got done with the ACL, did it feel the same? I didn't really fucking care. Like, I looked at it like, okay, that's the old me. Now I got to figure out a new skill set.
yeah,
And people ask me, does it feel the same? It's like, I don't know. I don't remember. I got a short memory. So I was never fixated on what I used to do. I
yeah,
was more fixated on going forward. And
yeah,
so whenever I meet people with these injuries, I always, they like get so, it doesn't feel like it used to. It doesn't feel the same.
yeah,
And I'm like, you need to abandon this whole fucking thought process of comparing
yeah,
yourself today. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's like, the same man doesn't walk in the same, or a man doesn't walk in the same river twice, because the next time he
right,
walks in the river, it's a different river and he's a different person.
right,
Right.
right,
And that's the same thing with injuries. And that's the quote I give people for the injuries. I'm like, you're not the same person, one, for the injury and for the time and the environment. So stop
yeah,
looking back in the past, seeing what you used to be. All you know is what going forward. All that is, in the age old, like, if you live in the past, you're depressed. You live in the future, you're anxious. You got to live in the present. And I always took this attitude of, injuries were just another way they were going to stack the deck around me, and where I was going to be able to prove that I was better. And
yeah, yeah,
when I talk to athletes, and I'm sure with the ACL stuff, you get this, like, it just doesn't feel the same. And they get kind of whiny with it. And I'm like, God damn it, shut the fuck up.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's not going to be the same. So stop expecting it to be the same. And you know what? We're blazing a new trail. But I mean,
yeah,
even my oldest brother, he tore his ACL in college. And after he tore his ACL and they fixed it, he was like the surgery and the rehab. He didn't want to play football anymore. He didn't want to hurt
Mm.
himself. And when he was done, he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to go play anymore. I'm done hurting my body. And whereas he asked me about it, I was like, I'll fucking break this ship on these rocks. Like I designed, like I built this thing to break, like, the Florence and the Machine song, like, like the smash it on the rocks. Like I always looked at it like that. Whereas like,
Yeah.
hey, I'm going to build such a tough organism that I can shatter myself on the rocks and rebuild myself as many times as I need to. And he looked at
Yeah.
me and he's like, you're a fucking crazy person. And I'm like, yeah, it's a difference. He's like, I just didn't want to hurt anymore. And I was like, yeah, the pain didn't bother me the same. And this is my older brother.
Yeah.
So like, same mom, same dad, same environment, grew up together, and just a completely different mindset. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the one fascinating thing with ACLs. Like you hear people break a leg or, break an ankle or, tear
Yeah.
a shoulder in this and like, oh yeah, they kind of come back. But for some reason, ACL, and that's why you said it better than I could have ever early on, where you're like, it's there's proprioception. There's something in that
Yeah.
ACL that's like giving micro feedback to the brain when you sprint, you run, and the
Yeah. Yeah.
deceleration that all of a sudden, once it goes, for a lot of people, they can never get that connection back.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And you know what? I'll tell you this much, and you already kind of touched on this, but um, I would not have really appreciated this unless I was measuring stuff, trying to understand stuff, getting pre-injury data, getting post-injury data, measuring over the long term, and then getting a high volume of people through that I would either be training or that I would be watching, sort of trained by other people to understand that there are so many shitty rehabs out there
Mm.
that are like, you know why you don't feel the same? Because your rehab was highly incomplete, and it's and it and you're missing things.
Yeah.
And man, I'll tell you this much is like when you see an athlete who's gone for 12 months and they've been doing things, for sure they've been, they look like they've been rehabbing, but they're not doing it the right way. They're not focused on the limiting factors. They're not focused on creating the positions and postures and the forces the way they need to with their training. And they just train on top of bad sort of foundation. They get 12 months down the road and I don't want to say they're permanently different, but their movement strategies that they've adopted to compensate for that injury are so ingrained and entrenched now. It is almost impossible to reprogram them towards something else. But when you describe that strength coach who came in and said, clean slate, we're going to get positive shin angles, we're going to
Yeah.
get you dorsiflex, we're going to get you, what that did was it rewired your brain in those connections to be able to say, I can use my body the way I used to.
Yeah.
Like you develop the confidence to be able to use that body, and that's a full system change. And I'll tell you right now, like that ability to get in there early and to have really good, smart rehabilitation and good progressive training over the long term, man, I think that's the magic that gets you eventually back to the point. Like it may not be at the same stage, like maybe at 10 months, one athlete's like, yeah, I feel fantastic. Maybe for the other athlete, it takes them to 18 months.
Yeah.
But you give them the necessary time with the right training. And I'm a big believer that most people can get back to feeling not just normal, but they can get it behind them. And on the other side, if you skip steps, I think that's a big reason why those rehabs don't go well. People don't feel right. And, we've got such a high incidence of re-injury. It just had bad rehab. Just didn't hit the things that they needed to hit.
Yeah. No, I think the bad rehab is universal. And the reason is people
Yeah.
get stuck within the paradigm. This is what we do in here, and it's
Yeah.
lazy and it's
Yeah.
lazy. And like you said,
Yeah.
it's very individualized, and it takes a certain individual to
Totally.
go out and figure out like all these other pieces. Like, and yeah, it's yeah, the ACL has just always been fascinating to me. I mean, one, because it happened to me, but I saw it happen so many times,
Yeah.
and they'd be like, "Oh, I tore his ACL. The guy will never be the same." And then also the variations in surgeries, like
Totally.
an
Yeah.
allograft versus the middle third of the patellar tendon, or
Yeah.
cadaver in this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember talking to Dr. Stedman, and he's like, we had hoped so much with cadaver tendons at this, but he's
Yeah.
like, at the end of the day, the middle third of the patellar tendon is still the
Still
best.
the best thing. But you know what that means though, is that, when we were talking earlier in the call and we were saying that, that there are foundational performance factors that you need to acquire that support the development of specific performance factors, which are the things that really make you tick. And then there's the final stage where you realize your peak performance potential, and you need to have that foundation to support everything else. I try to explain it. ACL injury is the best scenario to use that as a model where you need tissue and structure to support strength. You need strength to support power. You need power to support your plyometric ability. You need your plyometric ability to support your speed and your, like, these things all sort of build on each
It's like
other.
a
And if you
hierarchy.
take it is.
Yeah.
And if you
No,
take
no,
somebody who's
it's a hierarchy.
if you're missing tissue strength and structural tolerance, and you're missing muscular strength as a foundation, and you try to get somebody back running, like, it never goes well.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got scenarios where young athletes in your exact same position are brought back into running with huge gaps in foundational strength, and they end up in the exact same place, which is, my knee does not feel right.
Yeah.
Like, dude, it's not. It's
Well,
only. It was only an ACL injury until they went in there and repaired it, and now it's a neurophysiological injury. It is a full system, brain, muscle, tendon, everything is involved now in this injury, and you need to stop thinking about it as an ACL rupture, and you have to treat it like a neurophysiological insult to your body, which requires a very progressive approach. And man, you fill in the blanks, and it's like, hey, we got the tissue strength back, we got the strength back, now we've got the power capacity back. Then you try to return to run, and it's like, hey, it's going a lot better. No shit, because we've
well,
got those foundations there.
well,
So
what screwed me was they pushed me back way too fast, and I developed severe patellar tendonitis in the other knee.
yeah.
And all
Oh
of a
man.
sudden,
Yeah.
yeah. And now this is in like 96, 99.
Yeah.
I'm going and starting as a rookie in the NFL, step back
Yeah. Yeah.
and end up rupturing my patellar tendon on that left side. So what
Oh, I
they had
know.
done to
Yeah.
calm down the tendonitis, they had done iontophoresis, where they had used electricity to soak dexamethasone into the tendon, and they did it like not like a few times, many times. Like anytime I came in, they're like, "Oh, just put this dexamethasone patch on there, and we'll do this iontophoresis." And so all of a sudden now it's like, little did I know that soaking cortisone into your tendon weakens the tendon. All of a sudden,
Totally.
3 years later, I go out and end up rupturing patellar tendon, which was actually a
I know.
blessing in that, once it was ruptured, they cleaned all that up, stitched it all back, made it nice and tight.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, let that thing lock for 3 months. Everything grew back nice and thick, and, ended up, coming back and starting and playing 16 games that next year. But if I hadn't ruptured, that thing would have never healed the way it needed. It needed
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
level of trauma, tear the retinaculum, everything blows apart, stitch it all back, cleaned it all up, and then, all that healing started. And,
Yeah.
I mean, but it was one of those things where if they had just
Yeah.
done, and I don't know, I think people fail at the margins of their experience. I don't think anybody did anything malicious. I think you got football coaches that want a player to come back. You have
Yeah.
ATCs that are, good at taping ankles that probably shouldn't be doing rehab. You have strength coaches that are, hey, I'm trying to coach, and get, 75 dudes, 80 dudes strong. And here's this guy with an injury, let's just make him
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
now all of a sudden with the NIL and all this other stuff, the money's so much different. I mean, at the time we were,
Yeah.
living below the poverty line, now all of a
Yeah.
sudden you got the backup quarterback here at Texas making $10 million a year driving around a Lamborghini. So completely different environment. So I don't look at it,
Totally.
people were maliciously doing it. I think people
No.
just failed the margins of their experience,
I.
and their
It's
experience
exactly it.
was not what it needed to be. And,
Yeah.
like I said, like now I would know if it was my son, I'd be like, whoa, like we're going to fucking do something. So a big thing that we do within this podcast and Power Athlete and this, and I do a ton of consults, is trying to offer people, hey, I've been down, dealt with everything that you've dealt with,
Yeah.
allow me to be a, beacon of light. And if I don't know, I'm going to send you to somebody who definitely knows.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Well, your story here resonates with me so much because again, I won't get into any details, but It wouldn't be the first time that I've had conversations with young players where they are suffer an injury. They have the characteristic 2 year post ACL rupture, they blow the other knee.
Mm.
And in your case, you blew the patellar tendon, but you blow the other knee, and now you're coming back after two big injuries, and you are trying to navigate a world where you're like, what the hell do I do? And you know what's so interesting to me? I used the term the envelope of function before, but there's a really cool paper that's by an orthopedic surgeon named Scott Dye. And I might butcher this, so I apologize if anybody who actually knows the story. If I'm incorrect, I have many apologies. But my understanding was Scott Dye is an orthopedic surgeon, and you know what? He had a bummed out patellar tendon, the same thing that you were describing, and he was like, I need to get this thing repaired. And he was, at the stage where he was trying to rupture his patellar tendon. So he was like, I'm just going to freaking load this thing and just rip it apart so that I can go get my friend to go and stitch this thing back up and fix it. So, but he started to try to rupture it. And through the process of trying to rupture his own ACL, he noticed it was getting better.
Oh, wow.
And he was like, oh, fuck, it's actually feeling better. And so he came to this concept where he said, and he's an orthopedic surgeon, and he said that we contend that the act of restoring structural stability to the knee joint by repairing the ruptured ACL or reconstructing the ruptured ACL, depending upon the degree to which you've had whether it's a partial or full tear of the ligament. But that surgical process is just one initial step in sort of repairing something that's been damaged, but we don't equate that to restoring function to the system.
Mm.
That's a different thing. And in that whole series of articles, he introduces this concept of what he calls the envelope of function. And he says this envelope of function is conceptual, but it describes what you need in a sport-specific manner across a high force and a repetitive loading continuum. And he describes this process of rehab as restoring the envelope of function. And it's such an interesting idea that it was his experience as a surgeon trying to rupture his own patellar tendon so that he could get the thing fixed, that he realized that exercise is medicine, loading's medicine. Medicine ain't medicine. Putting that cortisone shot or whatever, it might actually help facilitate you to start loading. Like, that's how it should be seen. It's like, hey, we do this once, we settle it down, but now you can go, what you need to do is load it. But in that case, I'll tell you, man, the mechanical loading is the medicine.
Well, for me, like I said, the leg was so weak that, I mean, if you were to put me on the force plate, it's probably 90-10. And all of a sudden, you're over there trying to play on one leg and the tendon ends up blowing up. And it was, I mean, I go back and hindsight's 2020. All we can do is, go forward. And, my dad always said, those are people that forget the history, doomed to repeat it. I'm sure he stole that from somebody else. But he's like, if you don't, what was this? God damn. My dad's been dead a couple of years, and I should have sat down and written a book, all the things my dad said. But, it's one of those things where, what did he say? It was a wise man learns from his mistakes. It was basically like, if you can learn from the mistakes, like your mistakes and others, you'll get far ahead. A fool is the one that thinks that, he can't learn anything from it. But as I look back, I'm like, I have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with injuries and battling through this.
Yep.
And I have a, very sharp mind, remembering all of the, holes and problems. And you can either, be like, well, poor as me, or you can make a change and go forward and be like, what, like, this won't be my defining moment. And the one thing that I try to tell everybody with an athlete that gets injured is, do not let this injury define you. The year I came back, and I, came back from, basically I ruptured my patellar tendon. I'm laying in the training room, and the, guy comes in after the x-rayed, and the orthopedic surgeon looks at me and he goes, you ruptured your patellar tendon. We've never had anybody come back from this injury. This is your end of your career. I'm like 23 years old, starter, rookie. I look over, my mom, my dad, my dad starts tearing up. My mom's tearing up, like, this is the end of my career. And I remember laying there and be like, this is not how this fucking story ends. And I ended up coming back and starting 16 games that next year. And it was funny because they ended up, there was another guy that had a knee injury, and they ended up he came back in, I think out of 16 games, maybe played in 6, and they gave him
Mhm.
comeback player of the year.
Hmm.
And my guys on my team were like, dude, this guy had a fucking worse injury and started
Yeah.
16 games, but he was a little more well-established player. I mean, I was a rookie, and now I'm in my second year. Nobody noticed.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah. Yeah.
shit, man. I mean, that guy won comeback player of the year, and he played in 6 games. And they were like, oh, this guy's a
Yeah. Yeah.
warrior in this. I'm like, fuck him. I had
Yeah.
a season-ending injury with a doc that told me my career was finished, and then came back and started 16 games. You guys can fuck off.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
idea of like, do not go gentle into the good night, Dylan Thomas, my
Yeah.
favorite poem, is how I've lived all of this. And when I try to talk to my athletes or any of the people we work with, it's like, dude, this is not defines you. You define you, and do not let an injury define you. And I tell this to, my young athletes, the idea of like being process driven, not results driven. Like, this is
Right.
part of the process. Injury is a process that allows us to, make pivots and move and do different things. Like,
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm injured, I can't do this anymore. No, this is just a pivot. But that idea of process versus results is important. But the big thing with the ACL stuff, and it's almost like this mental coaching of like,
Yeah.
it's not going to
Yeah.
feel the same, so don't expect it. This isn't going
Totally.
to find you. We can solve this. There's millions of data points. There's people all over the world that will return better
Yeah.
to play. Like, this is not you. And I think there's this siloed feeling like, this is happening to me. This is unique to me. And I'm like, dude, there's been a million ACL tears,
Yeah.
if not more. And people have come back and played at a high level. I mean, I came back with a patellar tendon rupture that they said I would never play again. So
Right. Right.
that
Right.
idea of like that mindset. And I always wonder if, for all the things we discussed today, the one thing that becomes increasingly more difficult to do is like, how do you manage the mindset and make sure that the
Yeah.
person is in this positive? Because I saw my older brother, he tore his ACL, and he's like, I'm done. I never want to do this again. I don't want to go through this injury. I don't,
Yeah.
I didn't like it. Whereas for me, it didn't even bother me. And, that's something too, working with Victor and this back thing. I'm like, this won't define you. This isn't who you are. This is just a blip on the scale. And we were talking yesterday. I'm like, how's the back feel? He's like, I didn't even thought about it until you brought it up.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's what you want for your athletes. You want them to train and
Totally.
have all of these skills where all of a sudden, like, oh yeah, you remember your back was messed up? No, I don't even remember that.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to get people past that or to that, but we'll do our best.
Yeah. Agreed.
Well, cool, dude. That was 2 hours. And
Yeah.
it felt like 10 minutes. It felt like I was talking to an old friend. So
Yeah. It was
these are always
amazing.
the best
Great chat.
podcasts.
Yeah. That was awesome. Yeah. I really enjoyed it.
So if people want to get in touch with you, or, take some of your courses or learn more about your research, jordanstrength.com.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Yeah. Go to jordanstrength.com. My X account is more focused on the research stuff that we're doing. My Instagram account is much more focused on my digital education program and what I provide to professional teams, sport organizations, strength coaches, clinicians, sport. We've got all kinds of individuals who take the courses online. But if you pop online to my website, we have a whole bunch of different offerings. But the main thing is anything that we talked about today, we try to put that into a cohesive system, teach you how to assess, monitor, track the things that matter, and obviously use training to change the things that matter. And we do that inside of a cohesive periodization system and try to pull it all together. So go check it out. And there's new things coming all the time. We've got a bunch of free resources, free videos to watch on force plate methodology if you're interested, or training, and new courses in the pipeline. So thanks for the opportunity to share that.
Yeah, no, definitely check it out, and we'll post the links and all that. But dude, thank you so much for taking the time, dude. I really appreciate it. And it was a thoughtful, wonderful conversation for me. And thanks for allowing me to share.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Looking forward to staying connected.
Sounds great. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in. Another episode of Power Athlete Radio. Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by ko-fi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's ko-fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.